By the shadows of Florence, love is painted in blood and gold. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Elara Voss ran out of cadmium yellow. She noticed the coincidence only later, when she had time to think about signs and omens and the particular cruelty of the universe delivering fate in a plain white envelope slipped beneath the door of her studio apartment on Via dei Servi. At the time, she was simply annoyed. She'd been in the middle of a restoration, a small Madonna and Child, commissioned by a retired professor who'd found it at a market stall and convinced himself it was a minor Florentine work from the 15th century. It wasn't. Elara had known that from the first hour of examination, but the professor was kind and the money was real, and she had learned long ago that truth and art didn't always need to occupy the same room. She set down her brush, wiped her hands on the paint-stained cloth she kept tucked into the waistband of her jeans, a habit her mother had called peasant-like, which was ironic because her mother's family had actually been peasants, and picked up the envelope. No return address. Her name was written in a precise architectural hand, not printed, not typed, actually written, the ink slightly raised from the pressure of the pen, the letters angular and controlled. She turned it over. A small wax seal on the back, dark red, pressed with what appeared to be an eagle in profile. Inside was a single card, cream stock, heavy, and a number with an Italian area code. You have been recommended. There is restoration work at Villa Morciano outside Florence. The compensation is significant. Call if you are interested. No name, no signature, just the number and the name of the villa. Elara stood in her studio with the afternoon light coming through the tall, unwashed windows, dust drifting in the beams like slow snow. Around her were the tools of her trade, the brushes arranged by size in ceramic cups, the jars of medium and solvent, the flat files full of reference photographs, the stacks of books on Italian Renaissance painting that she'd carried across an ocean from her apartment in Baltimore, a city she'd left 4 years ago and hadn't once missed. On the easel, the fake Madonna watched her with gold-painted eyes. She read the card again. The compensation is significant. Her rent was 3 months behind. The professor's fee wouldn't cover it. The gallery in the Oltrarno that had been showing her own work, the small, strange canvases she painted in the hours after midnight when the restoration work was done, had sold exactly nothing in the last 2 months. She was 29 years old, an American in Florence, on a visa that would need renewing in the spring, with paint-stained hands and a bank account that made her stomach clench every time she checked it. She called the number. It rang twice. Then a man answered, not the man who had written the card. She was somehow certain of that immediately. The voice was flat, professional, accented with the particular precision of someone who had learned English as a formal exercise rather than a living language. Miss Voss? Not a question. He already knew it was her. Yes, she said. I received a letter about Villa Morciano. You did? A pause. Are you available to visit the property this week? Thursday, perhaps. A car will be sent. She almost asked, sent from where, sent by whom? But something in the flatness of his voice, the certainty of it, the absence of any expectation that she might decline, made her simply say, Thursday works. 9 o'clock. Be ready outside your building. He hung up before she could respond. Ilara stood holding her phone for a moment, then set it down on the work table among the brushes and the solvent jars. She picked up her brush. The fake Madonna watched her from the easel, expression placid and slightly smug, as if she knew something. "Don't start," Ilara said, and went back to work. Thursday came with fog, which was not unusual for October in Florence. The city had a way of wrapping itself in mist in the autumn mornings, so that the Duomo disappeared behind it and the bridges over the Arno became ghostly suggestions of themselves. Ilara liked this. She had come to love Florence in all its weathers, but she loved it most when it was grey and secret, when the tourists thinned out and the city belonged again to itself. She was outside at 8:55, in her good coat, charcoal wool, slightly worn at the elbows, with her professional bag over her shoulder, the portable kit she brought to initial consultations, the UV flashlight and the magnifying loupe and the small reference folder. She looked, she hoped, like someone competent, someone who did not have 3 months of unpaid rent. The car arrived at 9 exactly. Not a taxi, a black Mercedes, long and quiet, with windows tinted dark enough that she couldn't see the driver until he stepped out. A compact, neutral-faced man in his 40s who said only, "Miss Voss," and opened the rear door. She got in. The interior smelled of leather and something else, something very faint, like expensive tobacco and cold air. The seats were the colour of bone. There was no sound when the door closed, the kind of engineered silence that costs money. They drove out of the city, south through the Val di Pesa, through the soft Tuscan hills that had been painted so many times they seemed to exist more in the collective memory of Western art than in any actual landscape. Vineyards, olive groves, stone walls. The fog thinned and then thickened again as they climbed. Villa Mortiano appeared around a bend in a private road flanked by cypress trees, and Ilara's first thought, before she'd registered the size of it, the age of it, the particular quality of its stone in the pale morning light, was that it looked like a place that held its secrets deliberately. It was large, without being ostentatious, 16th century at a guess, though additions had been made in later periods. The facade was pale stone, 3 stories, with deep-set windows that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. The grounds were formal in the old Tuscan style. Stone paths, box hedges, a fountain at the centre of a gravel courtyard that was not running, its basin filled with still water that had gone the colour of pewter. The front door was opened by a woman in her 60s, dark-clothed, grey-haired, her face composed into an expression of professional cordiality that did not quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Signora Fabli and spoke to Ilara in careful, accented English. "The dottore will see you in the Sala Grande, please." Ilara followed her through a marble entrance hall, cold even for October, with the particular chill of rooms that are not heated out of some principle she couldn't identify, and up a wide staircase whose banisters were wrought iron, worked into an intertwining pattern of vines and birds. The Sala Grande was on the 2nd floor, its ceiling 12 feet high, and it was, immediately and entirely, the reason she was here. The frescoes. They covered 3 walls, the 4th being mostly windows, and they were extraordinary. Or they had been. 16th century work, certainly, possibly earlier in parts, depicting scenes she didn't immediately recognize. Not the standard iconography of the period, not saints and Madonnas and biblical narratives. These were something else. Allegorical, perhaps, figures in classical dress against architectural backgrounds, their gestures formal but their expressions, even through the damage, the flaking and the discoloration, and the long water stain that ran down the northern wall like a dark wound, conveying something complicated, something that required looking at. She was already moving toward the nearest wall when a voice behind her said in Italian, "They are better than they look." Ilara turned. He was standing in the doorway she'd come through, or perhaps another doorway, she wasn't certain, because she hadn't heard him arrive. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, a jacket that fit too well to be anything but custom-made. His face was... She searched for the right description and couldn't immediately find one. Striking was too neutral, beautiful was too soft. It was a face built on strong lines, the kind of bone structure that photographers waited for. But what held her attention was the expression, or rather, the absence of one. A controlled blankness that suggested not emptiness, but depth deliberately contained. He was, she guessed, somewhere in his mid-30s. His hair was dark, slightly long, pushed back from his face. His eyes were grey, the colour of the water in the fountain in the courtyard below. He was looking at the frescoes, not at her. 16th century, she said, defaulting to professional instinct. Primarily, the leftmost section is earlier, possibly 1480s. He stepped into the room, and she noticed the way he moved, unhurried, precise, each step deliberate, without appearing so. The northern wall was damaged in 1944. The water damage on the east wall is more recent, a roof problem that has since been repaired. You know the history. I know everything about this house. He said it without particular emphasis, as if it were simply a fact. Then he turned to look at her, and something shifted in the quality of the room's silence. You are Miss Voss. Ilara. She held out her hand. And you are? A pause. Not long, a beat perhaps, but she noticed it. Dante Morciano. He shook her hand. His grip was firm and brief, and his hand was cold. The frescoes, she said, turning back to the wall because it was easier. I'll need to do a full condition assessment before I can quote the restoration. Probably 3 or 4 days of preliminary work. However long you need, he said. You'll have full access to the house. Signora Fabri will arrange whatever you require. I'll need to bring equipment, a portable scaffold for the upper sections, my own lighting. Arrange it. She looked at him. He was watching the frescoes again, his hands in his pockets, his expression that same controlled blankness. Can I ask, she said, who recommended me for this? Another pause. A mutual friend, he said. He didn't elaborate. And something in the way he said it, the slight, careful weight on the word friend, told her she shouldn't press. I can begin on Monday, she said. Good. He turned toward the door. Signora Fabri will give you the access arrangements. He paused in the doorway, not quite looking back. Miss Voss, take your time with the assessment. I want it done properly. Then he was gone. Ilara stood in the Sala Grande alone, surrounded by the damaged and extraordinary frescoes, in the cold and particular silence of Villa Morciano. She took out her loop and began to work. She returned on Monday with Marco. Marco Benedetti was 24 years old, her assistant on most projects, a conservation student at the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, who had the gift of patience and the flaw of excessive cheerfulness, which Ilara had learned to tolerate in exchange for his competence. He drove the van that held the portable scaffold, the specialized lighting equipment, the cases of tools. They arrived at 8 in the morning. The gates, iron, tall, set into a stone wall that ran the perimeter of the property, were already open. The same neutral-faced driver from Thursday was waiting in the courtyard, watching them park, with the expression of a man who had been told to watch and intended to do it thoroughly. "That man is watching us like we're going to steal something," Marco said, climbing out of the van. "We probably are, by his lights," Ilara said. "Every contractor in a house this size is a potential thief until proven otherwise." "Very reassuring, very Florentine of you." Signora Fabbri let them in and showed them to the Sala Grande. She had, apparently at someone's instruction, already moved the furniture in the room to the centre, covered with white sheets, a substantial amount of furniture, Ilara noticed, including some pieces that were almost certainly worth more than everything she owned. The floors were bare stone, pale and worn, beautiful in the morning light that came through the tall windows. The frescoes looked different in this light, more damaged in some ways, the true extent of the deterioration showing more harshly when she wasn't distracted by her first impression of them, but also more revelatory. Details she'd missed on Thursday, a face half hidden behind a column in the background of the central panel, watching the main figures with an expression that was either grief or understanding. A small painted inscription along the lower border of the northern wall, mostly obscured by the water damage, that she would need time and UV light to read. She began with the full photographic survey, systematic, methodical, each panel documented under normal light, raking light, ultraviolet. Marco worked efficiently beside her, repositioning lights and adjusting equipment with the quiet competence she'd come to rely on. They spoke little. This was the contemplative part of the work, the listening part, and Ilara moved through it with the particular concentration she gave to nothing else in her life. It was in the early afternoon, when Marco had gone to collect lunch from the village, that she heard footsteps in the corridor. She was on the scaffold at the time, a middle section, examining a particularly interesting area where the original intonacle had been repaired in what looked like the 17th century, a patch job that had preserved the earlier painting beneath it. She had her magnifying loupe in one hand and her UV flashlight in the other, and her whole attention was on the slight variation in surface texture that indicated the edge of the repair. The footsteps stopped. She looked down. Dante Morciano was standing in the middle of the room, hands in his pockets, looking up at her. He was dressed differently than Thursday, in dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, no jacket. It was a small thing, but it made him look less formal. Not less controlled, just differently contained. "You're here during the day," she said, and immediately regretted the observation, which implied that she'd been thinking about when he might appear. "I live here," he said, without particular inflection. "Of course." She came down from the scaffold, wiping her hands on her work cloth. There's a repair in the upper section here, 17th century probably, that's actually preserving some of the original work underneath. I want to understand its extent before I decide whether to remove it." He came closer, not toward her but toward the wall, looking at the section she'd gestured toward with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to understand. "Show me," he said. She blinked. Most clients did not ask to be shown. Most clients wanted progress reports and cost estimates and timeline projections. They wanted the work done. They didn't particularly want to understand how. "It's easier if you're up here," she said, meaning the scaffold. He looked at it, a lightweight aluminium structure, not particularly elegant, and then at her, and something that might have been very slight amusement crossed his face before disappearing. He climbed the scaffold with the same ease he moved through everything, unhurried, precise, and came to stand beside her on the platform. They were close, the platform was not large, and she was sharply aware of the warmth of him, the slight height difference, the way his attention, when he turned it toward the wall, had the same quality as a lens brought into focus. "Here," she said, holding the UV light at a low angle across the surface. "You can see the difference in the texture. The newer intonaco, that's the plaster layer, has a slightly different response to the UV. This patch was probably applied when there was damage from an earlier water incident, or possibly just age-related loss in the original surface. But instead of doing a full restoration, whoever did it just filled in over the top of the original?" He was looking at exactly the right place, his face close to the wall. "Yes, which means the original painting is still there, underneath. Protected, actually, by the 17th century repair, which is deeply ironic." "How so?" "Because the repair was probably done out of cheapness or ignorance. Someone who wanted to fix the visual damage without understanding what was beneath it. They thought they were covering a flaw. Instead, they preserved the original work, probably better than the restoration approach of their time would have." He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the wall. Then he said, "Good intentions don't always produce good outcomes, and bad ones sometimes preserve what they were meant to destroy." She looked at him. He was still looking at the wall, not at her. But there was something in the way he'd said it, a quality that made the words feel less like a comment on fresco restoration and more like a statement of something he'd learned from experience. "That's one way to think about it," she said. He stepped back from the wall. "What's the inscription on the northern section? You have it photographed?" She looked at him again. He'd seen her documentation then. "Part of it. I haven't been able to read it yet. The water damage is extensive, and I need to do more UV mapping before I can reconstruct the text." "It quotes Dante," he said. "The Inferno." A pause. "My family named the house for the poem, or the poem named them. I was never entirely certain which story was true." He turned to look at her then, directly, the grey eyes level. "How long for the full condition assessment?" "Another 2 days. Then I can give you a full report and a restoration proposal." He nodded. He climbed down from the scaffold. She noticed he used the outside of the rungs, efficient, and moved toward the door. Then he stopped. "Miss Voss?" "Ilara." A beat. "Ilara, when you have questions about the iconography, the subjects of the frescoes, come to me directly. There are documents in the library that aren't available elsewhere." He paused. "And the scenes in the eastern panel are not allegorical. They are historical." He left before she could ask what that meant. Ilara stood on the scaffold and looked at the eastern panel. Figures in formal dress, 16th century Florentine. A meeting of some kind, a negotiation, she'd thought. Men and women, arranged with the deliberate composition of formal portraiture, every detail precise. Historical. She looked at them with new attention. The careful arrangement of hands, the object that passed between two figures in the central scene, which she'd taken for a gift or tribute. The man in the background, the one whose face she'd noticed Thursday, half hidden behind the column, watching everything with that expression she'd been unable to categorize. A witness, she thought now, not a participant, a witness who understood what he was watching. She picked up her UV flashlight and went back to work. The condition assessment took 4 days, not 2. This wasn't unusual. Ilara had learned early in her career that fresco always revealed more the longer you looked at it, that the layers of paint and plaster held information that could only be read through sustained attention, the way a conversation's true meaning sometimes only surfaced long after the words had been spoken. She didn't apologize for the extension. Signora Fabri received the news with impassive acceptance. Marco rearranged his other commitments without complaint. On the second day, she began to understand the iconographic program of the frescoes. They were not religious. This was unusual for the period and context. The standard vocabulary of Florentine fresco, the Madonna, the saints, the biblical narratives, was entirely absent. What replaced it was something more complicated and more intimate. Scenes from what appeared to be the history of a family. Specifically, from the evidence of the documents Dante had mentioned, and which Signora Fabri, following instructions she didn't explain, had provided access to, the history of the Morciano family itself. The documents were in a leather-bound volume, the writing faded but legible in a 16th century Italian hand. A chronicle, essentially. Names, dates, events. And beside it, a smaller notebook that appeared to be a later edition, 18th century, she thought, in a different hand, offering annotations. The eastern panel depicted, as Dante had said, a historical event. She identified it now, 1512, the year the Medici were restored to Florence after their 18-year exile. The Morciano who had been involved in that restoration, whose face she realized now appeared in the background of the central scene, watchful and still, was described in the chronicle in terms that were carefully neutral in their language and less neutral in their meaning. A man of significant influence in the affairs of the city, one to whom obligations were owed by men of greater visible power. She sat with the documents in the library, a room that smelled of leather and time, and understood, slowly and with the particular clarity of someone assembling a picture from fragments, what the Morciano family had been. What they had always been, perhaps. What they still were, in some iteration. She thought about the plain white envelope, the wax seal, the precise handwriting, the way Dante had said, without particular emphasis, "I know everything about this house." She went back to the frescoes. On the third day, she found the hidden panel. It was behind a large canvas painting in a heavy gilt frame, a 17th century landscape not particularly distinguished, that hung on the south wall between two of the original fresco sections. Standard practice sometimes in older houses, canvases used to cover damaged or damaged-appearing areas that were considered unsightly or unfashionable. She moved it carefully with Marco's help and found beneath it a section of fresco that had been sealed and covered intentionally, the careful plastering around the canvas's frame suggested, at some point in the 18th century. The seal was recent, not in the 18th century. Someone, recently she thought, in the last decade or two, based on the materials used, had very carefully reinforced the plaster seal around the canvas, ensuring the section beneath remained hidden. She did not remove the canvas. Instead, she photographed everything around it, documented its dimensions and placement, and added it to her condition report with a note. Hidden section, north-south wall, covered. Extent and condition unknown. Recommend discussion with owner before any intervention. That evening, it was past 6, the light failing, Marco already gone, Dante appeared again. He'd developed, she'd noticed, a habit of appearing in the Sala Grande without audible approach, as if the house's acoustics cooperated with his preference for arriving unannounced. She had stopped being startled by it, or rather she had stopped showing that she was startled by it, which was close enough to the same thing. "You found the panel," he said. "Yes." She was standing in front of the canvas, her arms crossed. "I didn't touch the seal. I wanted to talk to you first." He looked at the canvas for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not enough to call it an expression, but a slight alteration in the controlled blankness, like a stone moved beneath still water. "Have you photographed it?" "The exterior, yes." He nodded once. "Don't remove the canvas." "I wasn't going to without your direction." "I know." He turned to look at her. "Have you made assumptions about what's beneath it?" She thought about the chronicle, about the annotations in the 18th century notebook, about a phrase she'd found in the annotations, written with a formality that somehow made it more disturbing. "The record of the matter was sealed from view so that it might not trouble those who had not earned the knowledge of it." "I've made hypotheses," she said carefully. "I'm not prepared to share them until I have more evidence." Something in his expression changed, subtly, briefly, but she caught it. Not surprise, something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, as if he hadn't expected her to answer that way. "Hypotheses require evidence," he said. "Yes. And you don't act without evidence." "I try not to." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. The evening light in the room had gone blue and dim, the frescoes behind her rendered in the amber of the few lamps that were lit. He looked in this light like a figure from one of the panels, the contained watchfulness of it, the sense of someone who had learned that observation was more valuable than action. "I'll have dinner brought to you," he said. "You've been here since morning." It wasn't a question. It was, she realized, an answer to something she hadn't said. "You don't have to." "You're working in my house," he said, with a finality that was somehow not rude. "Signora Fabri will bring it here." He left, and at 7 o'clock Signora Fabri appeared with a tray, bread, prosciutto, a small wedge of aged pecorino, olives, and a glass of red wine that Ilara tasted and recognized, even with her limited knowledge of Tuscan wines, as something very serious and very good. She ate standing at the window, looking out at the cypresses in the failing light. The house was quiet around her. She could hear, very faintly, what she thought was music, something classical, piano, coming from somewhere in the building below. She stood there for a long time, listening to it, not quite able to make out the melody. She began to understand his schedule by accident. It was the second week of work, and she'd stayed late, very late, past midnight, because she'd been in the middle of a delicate consolidation treatment on a section of flaking paint and didn't want to stop mid-process. The villa was completely still. Even Signora Fabri, who seemed to maintain a supernatural awareness of activity in the house, had retired hours ago. Ilara had borrowed the key from the Signora, or rather, the Signora had pressed it into her hand at some point in the first week without being asked, with the look of someone following instructions she'd been given in advance, and let herself into the villa with a kind of careful reverence for the quiet of it. She was on the scaffold, working by the light of her specialized lamps, daylight balanced, carefully positioned to replicate the conditions under which she'd been working, when she heard, below, the sound of the front door. Not a creak or a clatter, just the precise, controlled sound of a lock being turned and a door being opened and then carefully, deliberately closed. Footsteps on the marble entrance hall, the staircase, a pause in the corridor outside the Sala Grande, then the door opened. Dante came in and stopped when he saw her lights. He was dressed for the outside, dark coat, no tie, and he was carrying a phone in one hand. His face in the first moment of seeing her had something on it that disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. Not surprise, not quite. "You're still here," he said. "Consolidation treatment. I didn't want to stop." He looked at the section she was working on, the northern wall, the lower section, close to the water damage. "It goes well?" "So far." She looked at him, at the coat, at the late hour. "You've been out?" "Yes." He didn't elaborate, she didn't ask, but she filed it away, the late hour, the controlled quality of his return, the faint smell that came into the room with him, cold air, and beneath it, something else. Cigarette smoke. Not his, she didn't think he smoked, but someone else's, caught in the fabric of his coat. He crossed to the windows and stood there for a moment, looking out at the dark grounds. His reflection floated in the glass against the black of the night, sharp and still. "The Dante quotation," she said, "on the northern wall. I've reconstructed most of it." He turned. "And?" She quoted from memory. She'd committed it to notes first, that it had stayed with her. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." He was very still for a moment. Then, "You know your Inferno." "I know that line. Everyone knows that line." She paused. "Why would someone inscribe it in a room of the house, in a private house?" "As a reminder," he said, "or a warning." "For whom?" He looked at her steadily. "For those who entered with full knowledge of what they were entering." She looked back at him for a moment, then turned back to her work. The consolidation treatment required attention. The brush had to be held at a precise angle, the medium applied sparingly, with the patience that was, she had been told since her first year of training, the whole of the discipline. He didn't leave. She became aware of him in the room behind her, not moving, not speaking, just present. Standing by the windows or sitting, she wasn't sure, she didn't turn to check. But after a few minutes, she noticed she was no longer alone in the way she usually was when she worked late. The silence was different, fuller somehow. The room had a different quality when he was in it. "The figure in the background," she said. "The observer in the eastern panel. I think it's a self-portrait." A pause. "Of the painter?" "Yes, painters sometimes did that, inserted themselves as witnesses to the historical scenes they depicted, a way of saying, 'I was here, I saw this, I understood what it meant.' And you believe this painter understood what they were depicting?" "I think they understood it more than the people commissioning the work wanted them to." She stepped back slightly to check the treatment, tilting her head. "The expressions are too specific, too knowing. A painter working purely from instruction would have made the figures more symbolic. These are portraits." Another long pause. She was aware of him coming closer, not to her, but to the wall, the eastern panel, where the meeting scene played out in its frozen 16th century light. "The painter was a woman," he said. Ilara turned to look at him. He was close to the wall, studying the figures. There are references in the family chronicle. She was brought from Siena. She worked on the Sala Grande over approximately 3 years. She was paid considerably well for the period. A pause. She was also required to sign a document swearing never to speak of the content of the frescoes or of anything she observed in the house during the work. like a contractor's NDA of the 16th century. She looked at the eastern panel. The woman in the background, the witness figure she'd identified, looked back at her from 500 years away, half hidden behind the column, her expression unreadable and therefore saying everything. "Did she keep the oath?" Ilara asked. "No one knows. The Chronicle doesn't mention her again after the work was completed." He was still looking at the panel. "She disappeared from the records, which could mean many things, including that she kept the oath." "Yes," he said, "including that." There was a quality to the silence that followed that Ilara felt in her chest, behind her sternum, a kind of pressure. She turned back to her work. They stayed like that for another hour, him present and mostly silent, her working with the careful attention the treatment demanded. He asked 2 more questions about the fresco technique, intelligent questions, specific, suggesting he'd thought about it or read about it before asking. She answered them directly, without the simplifications she sometimes used with clients who weren't interested in the technical reality of what she did. At 1:30, she said she was done for the night and began to pack up. "I'll have the car take you back," he said. "I can call a taxi. The car." She looked at him. He was watching her pack her tools with an expression she was beginning to learn. The controlled attention, the quality of observation that didn't feel invasive but felt thorough. "All right," she said. In the car, going back through the night city, through the fog and the empty streets, she thought about the painter from Siena and her disappeared oath, about what it meant to work in a house and come to understand the secrets built into its walls, about the particular intimacy of that, of being the person who saw what was painted behind other paintings, who read the hidden inscriptions, who understood the history that the family had sealed away. She thought about Dante Mocciano standing in the Sala Grande at 1 in the morning, smelling of someone else's cigarette smoke, asking intelligent questions about fresco consolidation technique. She thought she should be more careful. Her proposal was 43 pages long. She'd spent a week writing it, after the 4 days of the condition assessment, working on it in her studio apartment in the evenings after the restoration days, at the table beside the window that looked out onto the narrow street, where a scooter was always parked at a slightly different angle each morning, as if its owner used it at night and was always returning at the same time she woke. The proposal was the most thorough she had ever written. A full technical analysis of the fresco's condition, a detailed photographic record, a proposed methodology for each section, a timeline, a materials list, and a cost breakdown that she had revised 4 times before arriving at a figure that was real, that reflected the actual scope of the work, rather than a figure designed to win the commission. She brought it to Dante on a Tuesday afternoon. They sat in the library, not the Sala Grande. He had asked for the meeting here, which she found interesting, as if he wanted to discuss the work in the room that contained the documents that explained it. The library was warmer than the rest of the house, lined floor to ceiling with books in several languages, a fire burning in the stone fireplace despite the afternoon hour, 2 leather chairs arranged at angles to a low table. He read the proposal completely, not skimming, actually reading. She could tell from the pace of the page turns, the occasional stillness as he went back to reread something. She sat across from him, with her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing, because she discovered in other meetings that clients needed silence to absorb the weight of what she was telling them, and because this particular client, she already understood, did not appreciate interruption. When he finished, he set it on the table and looked at her. The hidden panel, he said. You've recommended leaving it sealed? For now, until we've completed the documented sections and you've had time to decide whether you want it opened. She paused. I think it contains something significant. But significant can mean many things. It might be a damaged section that was sealed to prevent the loss from spreading. It might be a section depicting something that, as the 18th century annotation suggests, the family wanted sealed from view. And you have a preference? Professionally, I want to open it. Every sealed fresco section is an unrealized piece of the whole. Artistically, historically, it matters. She looked at him. Personally, I think you already know what's there, and you'll tell me when you decide I should know. The silence had a different quality than the ones she was getting used to, something alert in it. What makes you think I know? He said. You know everything about this house. You said so on the first day. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the timeline. 3 years. The full restoration? Yes, approximately. Possibly less if the hidden panel is left sealed, but 3 years is fine. He said it simply, without the flinching or the negotiation she expected. Most clients wanted to discuss the timeline, compress it, find ways to spend less and wait less. He simply accepted it. When can you begin the actual restoration work? I need 2 weeks to source the materials. Some of the pigments have to come from specific suppliers. For historical accuracy, I work with traditional formulas wherever possible, and I need to arrange my other commitments. He nodded. Signora Fabri will prepare a room for you in the house. She blinked. You don't need to do that. I can drive from Florence each day. That's an hour and 15 minutes each way. In winter, longer. He looked at her with the level grey eyes. I'm asking you to give 3 years to this work. The house should be available to you. She thought about her apartment. 3 months of unpaid rent, the long winter drive, the professor's fake Madonna still on the easel, waiting. I'd need to give notice on my apartment, she said. Of course. And I'd still have my own work, my own paintings. I'd need space for that. There's a room on the 3rd floor with north light. It's been empty for some time. She looked at him. He was looking at the proposal on the table, not at her, with the expression of a man whose mind was already on the next thing, who had made this offer as simply as arranging a transportation detail. All right, she said. He looked up. All right. What's the name of the painter? She asked. The one from Siena, the one who did the frescoes. He thought for a moment, or appeared to. The chronicle lists her as Marta di Luca. Nothing else is known. Elara looked at the wall of books behind him. Somewhere in there, probably, was everything that was known about the history of this house and the family that had lived in it. Everything except what was painted behind the sealed canvas. I'd like access to the library, she said, for the research. It's yours. He stood, the meeting evidently concluded to his satisfaction. Miss Voss. Elara. A pause that was becoming almost a rhythm between them. Elara. The proposal is accepted, all 43 pages of it. She collected her copy from the table and stood. At the door she paused, because something had been troubling her since the assessment, and she had been waiting for the right moment. The eastern panel, she said, the negotiation scene. The object being transferred, I've identified it from the chronicle references. It's a ledger, an account book. She looked at him steadily. The meeting depicted is a financial arrangement, a significant one, based on the way the painter rendered the formality of it. She paused. The man receiving the ledger has the Morziano family crest on his ring. He looked at her. Yes. And the other man, the one giving it, the man with his back partially turned. She paused. He has a Medici device on his sword hilt. Yes, he said again. So this is a record of a financial arrangement between the Morziano family and the Medici. A record of a particular kind of arrangement, he said. His voice was entirely level. The kind that doesn't appear in public ledgers, the kind that is painted on walls of private rooms, so that both parties understand the terms have been witnessed and recorded, but in a language that only those who already know the story can read. The fire crackled behind him. I see, she said. I think you do, he said. And the way he said it, the slight gravity of it, told her that this was something, this capacity she had for reading what was painted rather than what was said, that he had expected and perhaps been waiting for. She went home to her apartment and sat with the traffic sounds of Florence coming through the window, the light fading from terracotta to grey, thinking about secret ledgers and painted walls and the language of things that cannot be spoken. She moved in on the 1st of November. She did not bring much, 4 years of life reduced to the things that mattered. Her professional kit, 2 large cases carefully packed, her books, 4 boxes, her painting supplies, 3 large crates of canvas, stretcher bars, brushes, tubes, the modest chemical kit of her solvent and medium, her clothes, which fit in 2 bags, and the fake Madonna, still unfinished on its panel, wrapped in protective cloth. Marco helped her load the van. He surveyed the amount of her possessions with the expression of someone who wants to say something consoling, but can't find the angle. You're sure about this? He said. It's practical. Long commute in winter. Right. Practical. He loaded the last box. He's interesting, the owner. I looked him up. She paused with her hands on the van door. And? There isn't much, which is interesting in itself. The Morziano family name comes up in connection with various... He stopped. Business interests. Florence, Milan, some activity in Rome, nothing specific, nothing public. Another pause. The villa was apparently used for a significant meeting in 2019. I couldn't find details. Marco. I'm just saying, the condition report is very thorough, but it doesn't cover, I know what I'm doing. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. You always do, he said. That's what worries me. The room prepared for her was on the 2nd floor in the east wing. Large, high-ceilinged, with tall windows that looked out over the formal garden and the hills beyond. The furniture was old and solid, a dark wood bed frame, a writing table, a chest of drawers, and someone had placed fresh flowers on the windowsill, white roses, already half opened. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the flowers and didn't analyze them. The studio room on the 3rd floor had, as Dante had said, excellent north light. Bare walls, a wide plank floor, slightly uneven with age. She spent the afternoon arranging it, unpacking her painting supplies, stretching 2 canvases on their frames and leaning them against the wall. The fake Madonna she set on the makeshift easel she'd constructed from a stepladder and a strip of wood, a temporary arrangement. She'd bring a proper easel from Florence. She was cleaning her brushes when Signora Fabri knocked and entered. "Dinner is at 8, the older woman said, "in the Sala da Pranzo on the first floor." A pause. "When the dottore dines at home, he takes it at 8. Ilara looked at her. "Should I join him?" The signora's face was neutral. "He has requested it." Ilara was not prepared for dinner. She was wearing her work clothes, paint-stained jeans, a dark sweater with a hole in the left elbow that she kept intending to mend. She changed into the best thing she'd brought: dark trousers, a silk blouse the colour of old parchment that her mother had given her, and the good boots. She looked at herself in the mirror over the chest of drawers and thought she looked like a woman who had dressed up more than she intended to. She went to dinner anyway. The Sala da Pranzo was on the first floor, a room she hadn't been in before. Smaller than the Sala Grande, but still formal, with a table that could have seated 12 and was currently set for 2 at one end, the candles lit, the wine already opened. Dante was already there when she came in, standing, not seated, looking at a painting on the wall, a small landscape in the Flemish style, nothing remarkable. He looked at her when she entered. The look lasted a moment longer than necessary, and then he turned to the table. "I hope the room is comfortable," he said. "Very." She took the chair indicated, to his right, close enough to speak easily, far enough that the length of table stretched behind them into the candle-lit dark. "The north light in the studio is excellent." "I thought it might be. The room was used for a similar purpose once before." He unfolded his napkin. "In the 19th century. A painter who stayed for some months. Another restoration. An original work. A portrait of my great-great-grandmother." He gestured toward the wall, opposite the fireplace, and she realized there was a painting there she'd barely registered when she came in. She looked at it now. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 30. Her face had a directness to it, dark eyes that met the viewers straight on, an expression that contained something amused and something watchful in equal measure. She wore the dress of her period, dark red, the collar precise, and around her neck a pendant, small, gold, in the shape of an eagle, like the wax seal on the envelope. "She's remarkable," Ilara said. "She ran the family's affairs for 30 years while her husband was occupied elsewhere." He said the last 2 words with a flatness that closed the subject. "She corresponded in 4 languages and played the violin to a professional standard, and was, according to all accounts, absolutely without sentiment." "You say that approvingly?" A pause. "I say it accurately." The first course arrived, soup, dark and aromatic, brought by a young man she hadn't seen before, who moved with the same neutral efficiency as the driver, and clearly worked under the same instructions. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Ilara had expected awkwardness, the strangeness of dining with a client, in his house where she now lived. But the silence had a quality she was getting used to, a quality of being inhabited by someone who was present without requiring performance. "Your own work," he said when the soup was cleared. "What do you paint?" She considered her answer. "Nothing you'd recognize a subject in," she said. "It's not figurative, not exactly." She looked at the great-great-grandmother on the wall. "I paint what things feel like, rather than what they look like." He turned to look at her. Really look at her, not the way he looked at the frescoes, though actually she thought it wasn't entirely different, with the same quality of attention. And is there a difference? There usually is. What things look like is a surface. What they feel like is what the surface is protecting. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to see your work. She looked at him. The candlelight made his face warmer than she'd seen it in daylight, cast shadows that gave his stillness a different quality. It's not finished, she said. It doesn't need to be. He turned back to his wine. When you're ready. The dinner ended at 10 o'clock. At the door of the dining room, Elara paused. Dante, she said. She'd used his name for the first time. It came out naturally, as if she'd been doing it in her head without noticing. He stopped, looked at her. Thank you for the flowers, she said, in the room. Something crossed his face, brief, barely legible. Signora Fabri arranged them, he said. Right, she said. Good night. She went upstairs to her room, and the white roses had opened further in the warmth, and she lay in the old wooden bed and listened to the house settle and breathe around her in the dark. November came in earnest. The Tuscan hills went grey-green, the mist lower and longer in the mornings, the light, when it appeared, having the sharp, pale quality of cold. Elara fell into the rhythms of the house as if she'd been waiting for them. Early mornings in the Sala Grande, when the light was at its best, the long, quiet hours of restoration work, the occasional interruptions when Marco came from Florence to assist with the more physical demands of the work. Evenings she spent either in her third-floor studio, working on her own canvases by lamplight, or in the library, reading, the Chronicle, the annotation notebook, and the wider collection of the library itself, which turned out to contain a remarkable archive of material related to the villa and to Florence more generally. Dante ate at home approximately 4 nights a week. On the other nights he was out. She heard the car, late returns, the subtle recalibration of the house when he came back. And on those mornings he was sometimes there and sometimes not for breakfast, which Signora Fabri served with the quiet impassiveness of someone who had accommodated unpredictable schedules for many years. They had developed, without explicitly deciding to, a kind of daily conversation that happened in the Sala Grande in the evenings. He would appear, always at varying times, never announced, and she would be at work, and they would talk about the frescoes for a while, and then, gradually, about other things. She learned things about him in the way you learn things about careful people, obliquely, slowly, through accumulation rather than disclosure. He had studied at Bologna, history, then law. He had lived in Milan for several years in his 20s. He spoke English with a slight formal accent that she'd initially thought indicated he'd learned it academically, but which she later realized was the accent of someone who'd learned it very young, from a private tutor rather than from other children or from television. He had a half-brother in Rome whom he mentioned once, in a context that was neutral in its language and not neutral in its implications. He read extensively and specifically. She saw what he was reading in the library, books that ranged from Renaissance art history to contemporary economic theory to, on one occasion that she did not comment on, a legal text in Italian, whose title she recognized as related to the regulation of organized. She didn't comment on it. She was not naive. She had understood from the first week something about the nature of the household and the nature of the man who ran it. The plainness of the security, the driver, the signora, the young man at dinner who moved like someone trained in more than table service, was not the security of a wealthy Florentine businessman. The documents in the library were not the archive of a private family estate pursuing legal commercial interests. And the inscription above the northern fresco, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," was not, she had come to understand, a decorative literary allusion. But she was also not afraid, which she recognized as perhaps the thing she should have been most concerned about. She was working on the northern wall, the water damage section, the most technically demanding part of the restoration, on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard voices from below. Not unusual, Dante received visitors, meetings that happened in a room she'd identified as a formal study on the first floor, the door of which was always closed when visitors were present. But these voices were in the entrance hall, which was directly below the Sala Grande and raised. Elara was on the upper scaffold. She stayed very still. The voices were in Italian, rapid, overlapping, with the particular compressed intensity of an argument that was being conducted just below the surface of something that wasn't an argument yet. Two voices she didn't recognize, and Dante's, lower, slower, with a precision that cut through the other two the way a single clear note cuts through noise. She couldn't make out individual words, but she heard the tone. The two other voices hot, urgent, pushing. Dante's voice steady, authoritative, and beneath the authority, something very cold. Then silence. Then one voice, much quieter, conceding something. Then the front door. Elara went back to work with the careful attention she gave to sections that required it, and didn't think about what she'd heard. Or rather, she thought about it with the part of her mind that processed information without requiring it to resolve into action. The way she thought about the hidden panel, holding it, turning it, waiting for it to tell her what it was. 20 minutes later, Dante appeared in the Sala Grande. He stopped when he saw her on the scaffold. The controlled blankness was in place, but something had shifted beneath it. A slight compression in the line of his jaw, a quality of energy contained. She came down, not because she felt she should, not because of anything in the scene below, but because she'd been about to take a break anyway, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "Long day?" she said, which was nothing like what she would have said a month ago. He looked at her for a moment, with a small sharpness that she recognized as surprise, quickly suppressed. Then, "Manageable." She poured 2 glasses from the carafe of water on the work table. She kept it there for long days, and handed him one without asking. He took it. "The northern section is going well," she said. "I've stabilized the edge of the main damage area. The paint layer there is more robust than I expected, probably because it was applied over a thicker intonaco than the other sections." He looked at the section she indicated. The stability and attentiveness of his gaze on the wall did something it always did, brought him into a kind of stillness that was different from his usual controlled stillness, something relaxed in it. "The painter knew this wall would be more exposed," he said. "The north-facing window, more humidity." Exactly. She compensated. She was more technically skilled than the style suggests. He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the wall. Then, "The style suggests ceremony, formality." Yes, the iconography is highly conventional, but the technique beneath it is individual, personal. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. "2 languages," he said. "Exactly," she said again, and looked at him. "The official one and the real one underneath." He turned to look at her then, and the grey eyes had something in them she hadn't seen there before, or perhaps had seen but hadn't named. An acknowledgement. the recognition of someone who understood being seen. He set down the water glass. "I have a meeting in Florence tomorrow," he said. "I'll be back Thursday." "All right. I'll leave the gate code with Signora Fabri, and Ricci will be here if you need anything." The neutral driver, she'd learned his name. "He has instructions." "I don't need a—" "He has instructions," he said again, "regarding your safety." She looked at him. "Is there a reason I need to be thinking about my safety?" He held her gaze for a moment, something deliberate in the pause, the measured choice of what to say. "The house has a history," he said, "and the history occasionally has a present tense." She stood with that for a moment. The fire popped in the grate in the corner, where she'd lit a small stove for warmth in the evenings. "Dante," she said, "I'm not going to ask you questions you're not going to answer." A pause. "I know. But I'm not naive." "No," he said, "you're not." And the way he said it, the quality of acknowledgement in it, almost of respect, stayed with her long after he'd left the room. She woke to rain at 3 in the morning, the sound of it against the tall windows of her room, not the soft rain of Florence in autumn, but a real storm, the wind in the cypresses like a tide, the water coming in sheets. She lay and listened to it and couldn't go back to sleep, which was unusual. She had the painter's gift of sleeping well, a skill she'd developed deliberately because irregular hours and physical fatigue demanded it. But tonight the house spoke in the storm. The old walls contracted and shifted, the timbers in the roof moved, and beneath it all she heard something that wasn't the rain. She put on her robe and went to the window. The grounds below were blue dark, slicked with rain, the fountain a white circle in the courtyard, and at the edge of the light from the house, at the boundary of what she could see, a figure, standing in the rain, unmoving. She felt a shock run through her that she identified after a moment as not fear but something adjacent to it, alertness, the body's cold recognition that something required attention. Then the figure moved, and she recognized the line of him, the particular still way he stood. Dante was in the garden in the rain. He was not wearing a coat. He was standing with his face turned up slightly, the rain hitting him, clearly had been for some time given the way the dark clothes were saturated, and the quality of his stillness was different from his usual stillness, less controlled, more exposed. She watched him for a moment from the window, then she put on her boots and went downstairs. She found her way through the house by memory. She'd been here long enough to know it in the dark, and out through the side door that opened onto the formal garden. The rain hit her immediately, cold and complete. He heard her before she reached him and turned. In the darkness and the rain, his face was stripped of the architecture of control. Not open, exactly. That wasn't the right word for a man like him, but unguarded. The way a room looks when no one expects anyone to enter it. "You should be asleep," he said. "I could say the same." "I do this sometimes," he said. Not an explanation, just a fact. Stand in the rain in the middle of the night. "When I need to not think." She stood beside him. The rain was relentless, and she was immediately soaked. She didn't move to leave. "Does it work?" she said. A pause. "Sometimes." They stood in the rain for a while. The storm moved through the cypresses with a sound like the sea, and the house stood behind them, lit from within, its old stone holding all its centuries of secrets and reigns. "There are things happening," he said. "With the family, with the—" He stopped. "Obligations." "You don't have to." "I know I don't." He was quiet for a moment. But there's a particular quality to certain nights when the weight of everything becomes architectural, like a structure pressing from all sides, and I found the best counter-pressure is physical reality, she said. Cold rain. He turned his head to look at her. In the dark, the grey eyes were almost black. Yes, he said. I do the same thing, she said. Not rain, usually. I paint, in the middle of the night. Something about the particular material reality of it, the brush, the paint, the physical resistance of the canvas cuts through everything abstract. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. The rain ran down his face, his neck, the collar of his shirt. "Show me," he said. "Your work, now." She looked at him, at the rain and the dark and the impropriety of it. She was in her robe, for God's sake. And then she said, "All right." They went inside, dripping on the marble floors, and she led him up to the third-floor studio. She lit the lamps, the good, warm ones she used for painting, positioned to give her the quality of light she needed. The two canvases she'd been working on stood against the wall and on the easel. He looked at them for a long time. They were not what most people expected. Not landscape, not figure, not abstract in the way the word was usually meant. They were dense, layered, painted and repainted over weeks in the way she worked, the surfaces built up with different media, different weights of mark. The colours were unusual, deep ochres, certain greens, the particular dark red she'd been using since Florence that she could never quite account for, as if it came from something in the city's stone. He looked at them the way he looked at the frescoes, with full attention, with the patience that indicated he was reading rather than viewing. "What is this?" he said, of the one on the easel, her current work, 3 weeks in, the most recent. "I don't title them," she said. "I paint something true, and then I let the viewer name what they see." "What do I see?" "I can't tell you that. That's the whole point." He turned to look at her. He was still slightly damp, they both were, and standing in her studio, in the warm lamplight, with the rain still audible on the windows, looking at her paintings with an expression that wasn't the controlled blankness and wasn't the guarded consideration. Something more stripped than either. "I see a door," he said, "and someone who knows there's a room behind it, but who hasn't decided yet whether to go in." She looked at the canvas. She hadn't told him that. She hadn't told anyone that. She'd been painting it for 3 weeks and hadn't consciously articulated to herself what it was about, the way she usually didn't. She let the image arrive rather than construct it. And now he had said in one sentence what she'd been circling around in hundreds of brushstrokes. "Yes," she said quietly. He turned back to the canvas. "Will you?" "Will I what?" "Go in." A silence. The rain moved on the roof above them. "I'm working on it," she said. He stood looking at the painting for another moment, then turned toward the door. He stopped in the doorway. Elara. Her name in his mouth had a quality she'd been aware of for some time, a slight, careful weight that suggested he used it deliberately, considered its use each time. "Go to sleep. You'll work better tomorrow." She listened to him go down the stairs, the solid sound of each step, the measured pace, and then she sat on the floor of her studio with her back against the wall and looked at the painting in the warmth of the lamps while the rain finished outside. 3 weeks after she moved in, she understood fully what Dante Morciano was. It happened on a Wednesday evening when she came downstairs for dinner later than usual because she'd been deep in a particularly absorbing section of the restoration, the lower left corner of the western panel, where she'd discovered what she believed was an underdrawing in a completely different hand from the painting above it, possibly indicating a change of plan mid-commission, and found, when she passed the door of the first-floor study, that it was open. Not by invitation. She hadn't been invited in. She simply passed, and the door was open, and she saw, without meaning to, and without being able to unsee it, the four men inside. Two she knew by sight: Richie, the driver, standing near the window, a younger man she'd seen twice in the past weeks, always near the gates, whose name she'd never asked. The other two were strangers, dark-suited, with the particular quality of attention of men who were accustomed to assessing the threat level of their surroundings. One of them had on the table in front of him a phone on which she could see, even from the doorway, even for the 3 seconds before she registered and moved past, photographs. Surveillance photographs. The kind taken from distance with a long lens. And Dante was standing at the far end of the table, one hand flat on its surface, looking at the photographs with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled blankness, not the guarded attention. Something very cold, something that had the quality of a decision already made. She moved past the door without stopping. She went to the sala da pranzo and sat at the table and waited for dinner, which Signora Fabri brought as if nothing had happened, with the expressionless efficiency she brought to everything. Dante came to dinner at 8:15, 15 minutes late. He was composed, impeccably so, the controlled blankness fully in place. He sat and poured the wine and asked about the underdrawing she'd found. She'd mentioned it at breakfast, with the specific, intelligent curiosity he brought to everything about the restoration. She answered. They talked about the fresco for 20 minutes. The food was good. Signora Fabri cooked simply and excellently, and the wine was the serious Tuscan red he seemed to serve always, the bottle always already open when they sat. At the end of the first course, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." He looked at her. He set down his fork. "Ask." "Am I in danger here?" A pause. Not a surprised pause. A considering one, the pause of a man deciding how much truth was the right amount. "Not directly," he said. "Nothing in the house is a risk to you. The circumstances of the family are," he chose words carefully, "complex. There are people who would use access to the house and its occupants as leverage, in theory. You are known to work here, which means you have, perhaps, attracted attention you wouldn't otherwise have attracted." "Whose attention?" "People who are interested in my activities." He held her gaze. "Not in you, personally. You are not a target. But I want you to understand the landscape." She looked at him. "What are you?" The silence was long. Not uncomfortable. She didn't feel threatened, which was interesting and possibly said something about her judgment that she should have examined more carefully, but waited with the specific gravity of a question that had been waiting to be asked. "My family has operated in Florence for 600 years, he said. "The form of the operation has changed. The fact of it has not." A pause. "We manage things for the city, for people who require management to be done outside the normal structures." That's very elegantly phrased. I'm trying to be honest without being irresponsible. She looked at the wine in her glass, the deep red of it in the candlelight. "The Chronicle," she said. "The Medici arrangements. The sealed panel." "Yes. You're telling me this has always been what the Morciano family was?" "I'm telling you I'm the current form of something that is 600 years old." He leaned back slightly. "The villa holds the record of it in the frescoes, which is why the restoration matters. Which is why I wanted someone who could read what was actually painted, not just what was officially depicted." "Me." "Your reputation suggested you were perceptive about what paintings say beneath their surface." She sat with that. Outside the windows, the November garden was dark, the cypresses barely visible against the sky. "Are you in danger?" she asked. He looked at her. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not the question itself, but the direction of it, that she was asking about him rather than about herself. "There are current difficulties," he said, which was not a denial. "The men tonight, the photographs." A pause. He looked at her, and something in his face, very briefly, was not controlled at all. "You saw that?" "I was passing. The door was open." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen again." "I'm not asking for protection from information. I'm asking if you're all right." Another silence, longer. The candles between them threw their light upward across his face, making the strong angles of it more pronounced, the grey eyes more complex in their colour. "I have been in more difficult positions than the current one," he said. "I will manage it." "I believe you," she said, and she did. They finished dinner. At the door she paused. She was doing this more often, pausing at doors, finding reasons to prolong the edge of his company. "Dante." He had already said good night and was turning to go. "The figure in the frescoes. The witness. The one who watches from behind the column." He turned back. "I think she painted herself watching because she understood that witnessing is its own form of power, that to see clearly is to know, and to know is to have a kind of," she searched for the word, "custody of the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I think that's exactly right." He left. Ilara went upstairs and lay in her room in the dark and thought about custody, about the particular responsibility of seeing truly, about what it meant to be the person who read the language beneath the language, and about the way he had said, "I have been in more difficult positions than the current one," with the matter-of-fact composure of someone for whom danger was not an abstraction. She lay there for a long time before she slept. Florence, the second Friday of December. Dante drove her to the city himself, which surprised her. She had been invited, through a gallery contact she'd maintained since arriving in Italy, to an opening at a gallery in the Oltrarno, a mixed show that included 3 of her own small works that the gallery had sold from a previous exhibition. The gallery owner, Bettina, had called to say one of the pieces had been selected for a private collector, and there was a conversation to be had. She'd mentioned it at dinner the previous evening, and he'd said simply, "I'll take you." No elaboration, no invitation sought. She had been about to say she could manage perfectly well on her own, and then she'd looked at his face, the neutral face, the grey eyes, the stillness, and said, "All right." He drove well, which she found herself noticing, the same quality he brought to everything, precise and unhurried, his hands on the wheel with a looseness that belied the attention. They drove mostly in silence, the kind she was entirely comfortable with now. the road to Florence from the villa being one she'd travelled enough to have stopped seeing its beauty and started simply feeling it. The hills, the vineyards, the stone walls. He parked near the Ponte Vecchio and walked with her through the narrow streets to the Oltrarno. She was aware of him beside her. The way he moved through the city was like his movement through the house, deliberate, aware of the space around him in a way most people weren't. He wasn't looking at the scenery, he was reading the street. The gallery was warm, crowded with a particular mix of Florentine art world people, Italian academics, expat collectors, artists in various degrees of commercial success, and Bettina greeted Ilara at the door with the exaggerated warmth of someone who'd sold your work and wanted you to be pleased about it. Ilara introduced Dante as a friend because she didn't know what else to say, and watched Bettina's eyes register him, the suit, the face, the particular quality of his attention, and recalibrate visibly. Her 3 pieces were on the eastern wall. She hadn't seen them hung, and for a moment she stood and looked at them with the complicated feeling she always had, the recognition of something she'd made, but which now had its own existence, separate from her, out in the world. They were small, 30 by 40 centimetres each, and they were from the period before Florence, before the restoration work, before the Morciano commission. Different in quality from what she was making now, she could see that immediately. They were good, but they were careful, controlled in a way that the current work wasn't. "These are earlier," Dante said beside her. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "They don't look like the ones in your studio." She turned back to the paintings. "They're from Baltimore, 3 years ago." "What changed?" She thought about it. "Florence," she said, "and the restoration work. When you're working inside something that was made 500 years ago by someone who painted as if the act of painting was the most important thing they could possibly do," she paused, "it changes what you're willing to risk." He was quiet, looking at the 3 paintings. Around them the gallery murmured and clinked. Then a man appeared at Ilara's shoulder, tall, well-dressed, 50 perhaps, with the careful grooming and confident ease of someone used to buying things. "Miss Voss?" The English was accented, not Italian, German, she thought. "I'm the collector who purchased your piece, Thomas Greiss." He held out a hand. She shook it. "I'm glad you liked it." "Liked it?" He laughed, a sound she didn't entirely trust. "I'd say more than liked. There's something in your work, a quality of—" he searched for the word. "Interiority, as if the painting is aware of being looked at." He glanced at the 3 pieces. "I'd like to commission something new, if you're open to it, specifically for my house in Hamburg." She was about to respond when she became aware of Dante, who was standing slightly behind her left shoulder, quite still. She glanced at him. He was looking at Thomas Greiss with the neutral face, but there was something in the quality of the neutral face, a particular density to it, that she recognized. He was not pleased. This was new information, or rather, it was information she'd suspected and now had confirmed. She filed it carefully. "I'm in the middle of a significant restoration commission," she said to Greiss, which was true and was also the response that was available to her. "My own work is limited right now, but I'd be happy to discuss what you had in mind." Greiss smiled and proposed dinner the following week, which Ilara managed to defer to an as-yet unspecified point in the new year. He excused himself to look at other work. She turned to Dante. He was looking at the paintings again. "He's not wrong," Dante said, "about the interiority. No. though his appreciation of it is somewhat commercial. She looked at the side of his face. Is that why you were looking at him like that? I wasn't looking at him like anything. You were. He turned to look at her. The grey eyes were close, and in the warm gallery light they were not grey at all, but a very pale, complex colour she didn't have a paint equivalent for. He shouldn't commission you, he said. That's interesting. On what grounds? He collects things, Dante said. He doesn't understand them. He wants to own what he can't comprehend. A pause, and something in the pause that was not entirely about Thomas Gryce.
It would be unsatisfying for you. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll keep that in mind. Bettina appeared and swept Ilara away into a conversation with two academics she needed to at least briefly maintain, and when she looked for Dante 20 minutes later, he was standing near the bar at the back of the gallery, in conversation with a man she didn't recognize, compact, dark-suited, the exchange brief and very quiet. By the time she'd extracted herself from the academics, the man was gone, and Dante was alone, holding a glass of wine and looking at a painting across the room with the expression that revealed nothing. In the car back to the villa, she said, "Who was the man you spoke to?" He glanced at her. "A business associate." "In a gallery?" "Florence is a small city for certain kinds of business." He paused. "It was nothing to concern you." "I didn't say I was concerned." He looked at her briefly, a quick sideways glance that had something in it, acknowledgement, perhaps, of the distinction she was drawing. "You're right. I'm sorry." She sat for a moment. He had apologized, simply, without elaboration, and it sat unusually on him, the words slightly at odds with the usual architecture of his self-containment. She stored it alongside everything else. "The collector," she said. "Grace, is he moves money in ways that are adjacent to certain interests I find distasteful." A pause. "He is not dangerous to you, but I would prefer you not enter his orbit." "You'd prefer?" He was quiet for a moment, navigating a roundabout at the edge of the city. Then, "I would prefer," he said, with a slight deliberateness that acknowledged what he was saying. "Yes." She looked out at the night city, the Arno black and reflecting the lights of the bridges, the Duomo a pale presence against the sky. "Tell me about the sealed panel," she said. "I've been waiting long enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tomorrow," he said, "after dinner." She turned to look at him, his profile against the passing lights of the city, the jaw, the controlled line of his mouth, the grey of his eyes on the road. "Tomorrow," she said. He told her over brandy, in the library, on a Thursday evening, while rain moved against the windows. He poured 2 glasses, the good brandy, she'd noticed he didn't serve the bad kind of anything, and set one in front of her across the low table between the 2 chairs, and then he sat and was quiet for a moment, with the glass cradled in both hands, which was the posture of someone marshalling themselves for something they had decided to do and were not entirely comfortable doing. "The sealed panel," he said, "depicts an execution." She held very still. 1563. A man named Giovanni Ruggieri. He was affiliated with the family. He had managed certain financial instruments on behalf of the Morciano for some years. He was also, it became known, providing information to certain parties in Rome about the family's operations. He paused. "The word that was used in the chronicle is tradimento." "Betrayal." "Yes." He turned the brandy glass slowly. "The execution was conducted on the grounds of the villa. The family had, and has, certain authorities that operate outside the city's legal framework, have always had them. The painting of the scene was, a brief pause, unusual. Most families would not have commissioned a record of such an event, but the patriarch at the time, Aurelio Morciano, was a man who believed that accountability required witness, that if you ordered a death, you should be willing to see it documented. Ilara looked at the fire. That's either very moral or very theatrical. Both, I suspect. He looked at the fire too. The panel was sealed in the 18th century. My ancestor at that time was a man who was more concerned with the family's public reputation than its private ethics. He had ambitions in the civic sphere. He wanted an appointment that required a clean public history. The panel, he gestured slightly, was not clean. And you? He looked at her. I had it more recently reinforced when I took over the management of the house. He held her gaze. Because I didn't want it opened casually or without understanding. But you want it opened now. A pause. I want you to open it, when you're ready, when the documented sections are complete. He turned the glass again. It should be seen. Marta de Luca painted it, the same painter who did the rest of the Sala Grande, and I suspect it is her most significant work. Why? Because she was present for the execution, he said. According to the annotation notebook, she was in the room. Not as a witness by instruction, she was found there. She had apparently... He paused. She had apparently been present in the house during the events leading up to it, for reasons the notebook declines to specify. Ilara looked at him. Something was settling in her, the way the final pieces of a condition assessment settled when the full picture became available. She knew Ruggieri, she said. Dante looked at her steadily. That is one hypothesis. She painted the execution because she felt she owed him the witness, because she was the person who could give it, who understood what she was seeing and could record it with the particular precision of someone who also... She stopped. Who also felt it. The fire crackled. The rain moved on the windows. I think you may be right, he said quietly. She sat with the brandy glass and the weight of 500 years of someone else's grief, translated into colour and plaster, sealed behind canvas for 2 centuries. I'll open it, she said. In the spring, when the other sections are stable enough that I can take the time to do it properly. He nodded. Dante. She looked at him directly. He was looking at the fire, his face in the firelight, with that stripped, unguarded quality she'd seen in the rain garden. Thank you for telling me. He looked at her then, and what she saw in his face, very briefly, before the architecture reassembled, was something she had been half aware of for some weeks. Something that moved beneath the surface of every conversation they'd had, beneath every careful evening, every shared silence, every moment of him standing in the Sala Grande watching her work. You needed to understand what you were working with, he said. Yes, she said, I did. She went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark for a long time, not thinking about the sealed panel, but about the grey eyes in the firelight and the precise, careful weight of her name in his mouth. December deepened and the villa settled into winter. The restoration work had reached what Ilara privately thought of as the intimate phase, the stage past assessment, past stabilisation, past the technical groundwork, where you began to actually restore, to work on the surfaces with the tools and pigments and media that would bring the damaged areas back into dialogue with the original.
It was the most demanding part of the work, and also the most absorbing, and she found herself spending longer hours in the Sala Grande than the light strictly required, the specialized lamps positioned to recreate the quality of the natural daylight, working in a silence that was broken only by the sound of her own brushes on the ancient plaster. Dante's visits to the Sala Grande had become, without explicit acknowledgement, a nightly occurrence. He appeared usually between 8 and 9 in the evening, and stayed for an hour or sometimes 2, and they talked about the frescoes and about other things, about history, about painting, about the particular philosophical problem of restoration, which was, she had articulated to him one evening, fundamentally the problem of deciding how much truth a damaged surface could bear to have revealed. Restoration is an argument with time, she'd said. You can't win. You can only negotiate. He'd thought about that. You can make the argument worth having. Yes, that's the best you can do. The nightly conversations had become, she recognized, the organizing center of her day. She worked all day with the frescoes and the quiet of the house, and in the evenings he appeared, and she was aware of how thoroughly she had rearranged her internal calendar around this fact. She was also aware that he was managing something difficult. She didn't know the specifics. He told her some things, left others deliberately opaque, and she had stopped pressing because she trusted by now that he would tell her what he chose to tell her when he chose to tell it. But the signs were visible to anyone paying attention. The late returns, the occasional darkness in his manner that he controlled too carefully not to have something concrete behind it. The phone calls he sometimes had to take during dinner, stepping out, brief, returning with the architecture reassembled. The meetings in the study, the frequency of which had increased. The evening, in the second week of December, when she came downstairs from her studio and found the entrance hall to contain 3 men she'd never seen, standing with the particular alert stillness of men whose job was to be alert and still, and Richie, in the doorway of the study, looking at her with an expression she could only describe as professionally apologetic. "Miss Voss," he said, "the dottore asks if you could take dinner in your room tonight." She looked at the 3 men. Of course. Dinner arrived in her room, excellent as always, and she ate at the writing table by the window and worked on sketches for the restoration of the eastern panel and listened to the muffled sounds of the meeting below. Not words, not emotions, just the periodic human fact of voices in a room, the occasional movement. Once, what she was fairly certain was the door of the study opening and closing with a controlled force that wasn't quite a slam. At 11, she heard a knock at her door. Dante looked, for the first time in their acquaintance, tired. Not visibly, his face maintained its usual architecture, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, the very slight compression at the corners of his eyes that she'd learned to read. "I wanted to make sure dinner was satisfactory," he said. It was. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in and stood in the middle of the room, looking at the sketches she'd left on the writing table. His hands were in his pockets. He had the quality, she thought, of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had reached the specific point of fatigue that comes before you can set it down. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." She had a small electric kettle, a concession to the English-inflected American habit of needing hot water at all hours, and tea bags she'd sourced from a British shop in Florence. She made 2 cups with the economy of someone who has made tea in the same limited circumstances many times, and handed him one, and sat in the chair across from him. He looked at the tea, then at her. "You make tea," he said. "I'm American with English training. I make tea in a crisis. It's a cultural inheritance." The very faintest suggestion of a smile crossed his face. "Is this a crisis? You tell me." He was quiet, holding the cup. Then, "There is a disagreement within the organization about the direction of certain operations in Rome." He paused. "A faction that believes the current management is insufficiently decisive." "Meaning you?" "Meaning me." He looked at the tea. The meeting tonight was with representatives who are trying to negotiate a resolution, which is, in itself, a sign that they are not confident enough to act without one. "That's reassuring." "Somewhat." He looked at her. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the situation clearly. Not because I want you to worry, but because—" He paused, choosing carefully. "Because you're here, and you're involved by proximity, and I think you deserve clarity." She looked at him for a moment, at the tiredness he was holding with such precision, at the fact that he was here, at 11 at night, sitting in her room drinking weak English tea and explaining the structure of a crisis in the Mafia organization he ran, because he thought she deserved clarity. "Dante," she said, "what do you need?" He looked at her then. The grey eyes were very direct. "I need this to be over," he said, "the particular problem, and I will resolve it." He paused. "I always resolve it." "I don't doubt that. But," another pause, "I find that I value this, the evenings, the conversations." He said it with a care that acknowledged the vulnerability of saying it. "I find that I value your presence in the house, more than is strictly explicable by the quality of the restoration work." The rain had stopped some time in the last hour. The room was very quiet. She looked at him steadily. "I find the same thing," she said. Something shifted in the room, a change in pressure, the way the air changed before weather. He set down his tea. He stood, and he looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she had not seen before, not the controlled blankness, not the guarded attention, not the stripped-down quality of the rain garden. Something more direct than any of those. Something that asked a question without words. Then he stepped toward her, one step calibrated, the patience of a man who understood the value of not rushing, and took her face in both hands. His hands were warm now, not cold, and he kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, deliberate, precise, unhurried, the kind of kiss that declared something rather than asking. She held very still for a moment, one breath, and then kissed him back. He pulled back first, his hands still at her jaw, his forehead not quite touching hers, the grey eyes close. "I should," he began. "Yes," she said, meaning, "Yes, we should be careful. Yes, this is complicated. Yes, I know what you are and where we are, and none of it changes the fact that I've been aware of this for months and trying not to name it." He stepped back. His hands dropped. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. He went to the door, paused, looked back at her once, a brief look that contained more than either of them had said. And then he was gone. Ilara sat in the chair for a long time with her tea going cold in the quiet house and listened to her own heartbeat. He said nothing about it at breakfast. This was, she recognized, entirely consistent with who he was. Dante did not revisit things in the daylight that had been said or done in the night, not because he regretted them, but because he held them differently. In daylight, he was the careful, precise manager of his household and his affairs. The other self, the one who stood in rain gardens and told her she valued her presence more than was explicable, was held in a different register. The two didn't contradict each other. They were simply aspects of the same person that were not shown simultaneously. But she noticed, in the days that followed, a change in the quality of his attention. He had always been attentive. From the very first day, his focus when directed at her had a quality that she'd felt physically, like the change in air pressure before lightning. But now there was something additional, a proprietariness. Not aggressive, not even visible to anyone who wasn't paying the kind of attention she paid, but present, definitively present, in the way he angled his body toward her in a room, in the way he introduced her to a visiting colleague one December afternoon. Ilara Voss, the restoration artist working on the Sala Grande, with a particular finality in the word working, as if establishing territory. In the way, at dinner 3 days after the kiss, he poured her wine before she had to reach for the bottle, and did it without looking up from what he was saying, the gesture so entirely natural that she understood he had been tracking exactly where she was in the room at all times. She found she didn't mind, which told her things about herself. She also found that the work in the Sala Grande had changed in a way she couldn't entirely account for technically. Her brushwork was different, not technically different, her years of training were too deep in her hands for that, but different in ambition. She was taking risks she hadn't taken earlier, restoring sections that a more cautious approach would have left in their damaged state, working back to the original with a confidence that came from, she tried to analyze it, from being seen. From the nightly conversations with a man who read her paintings the way she read the frescoes, all the way down. Marco noticed. He came 2 days a week now for the heavier physical work, and on the first day of the week of December 15th, he stood in the Sala Grande in the morning light and looked at the section she'd been working on and said, "This is different. Is it better?" He thought about it. "It's more committed, like you've stopped hedging." She looked at the wall. "Maybe I have." He looked at her with the perceptive eyes of someone who was 24 and had been watching people carefully since he was old enough to know that watching carefully was how you understood the world. Marco began. "Marco, I'm just going to say, don't. That this is a very complicated Marco." He stopped. Then, "You're happy," he said. "You look happy, which is, I just wanted to say, I can see that." She picked up her brush. "The west panel needs attention today, the upper left corner." He picked up his tools without further comment, and they worked in companionable silence for the rest of the morning, while the December light came through the tall windows and fell across the 500-year-old walls and the older-than-time patience of the frescoes. That evening, Dante came to the Sala Grande with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, which was new. He'd occasionally brought wine, but had always offered it as a service arrangement rather than a gesture. He sat on the corner of a dust-sheeted chair, legs extended, jacket removed, with the easy quality of a man in his own house who had decided he was comfortable in it. They drank and talked about the west panel. She'd made progress she was pleased with, and then about the political situation in the city, which was Dante's way of discussing certain pressures without naming them directly. And then about a book he'd been reading, a history of the Venetian Republic that he'd recommended to her in November and that she'd now finished. "The Doge system," she said, "the collective governance. Do you think it worked because everyone had something to lose?" "I think it worked because everyone understood that the maintenance of the structure was more valuable than any individual ambition within it." He turned the wineglass. Until it didn't. Until someone's individual ambition exceeded their tolerance for the constraint of collective interest. And then it collapsed. Slowly, very slowly, which is how these things always go. He looked at her. "How long have you been drawing the parallel?" She smiled. "Since November." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture he made when he found something he hadn't anticipated. "You could have said." "I was waiting to see if you'd draw it yourself." "And?" "You just did." He looked at her for a moment, the full, direct look, not filtered through the blankness, and something moved in the room between them. "Come here," he said. It was not a command exactly, it was an invitation with weight behind it, a question whose grammar was possessive. She got up from where she'd been sitting on the edge of the scaffold and crossed the room to where he was. He set his glass on the floor and looked up at her with the grey eyes, and when she sat on the arm of the chair beside him, close, their shoulders touching, he put his arm around her with the same deliberate naturalness as pouring the wine. Not urgent, not tentative, certain. They sat like that for a while, looking at the frescoes. "The Eastern panel," she said, "the witness figure. I think she was in love with him." He was quiet for a moment. "With Ruggieri?" "Yes. I think she came to the house because of him. I think she stayed because of the work. But the reason she witnessed the execution and painted it—" She paused. "I think that's grief. The way she painted it, the level of attention she gave to it." He tightened his arm around her slightly, not a response to her analysis, a response to something in her voice. "The best art is made from what we can't say any other way," he said. "Yes." She leaned her head against his shoulder, slightly by a fraction, and he didn't speak, didn't move, just remained, the warmth of him steady and certain. "Dante," she said, "the situation you're managing, the Rome problem." "Yes." "Tell me when it's resolved." "I will." "And tell me if I need to know anything before it is." A pause. "I will." He said it with the same quality as all his promises, as if the word contained a mechanism, as if saying it engaged something irreversible. They stayed like that, in the cold and lovely Sala Grande, with the frescoes watching them from the walls, and the December dark outside the tall windows, until Signora Fabri knocked to say dinner was ready. The crisis arrived on a Wednesday evening in January. The holiday had passed quietly. Ilara had returned to Florence for a week to see Marco and Bettina and manage the smaller professional obligations that required her physical presence in the city. The week had felt like holding her breath. She'd returned to the villa on the 2nd of January and found it exactly as she'd left it. Signora Fabri at the door, Ricci in the courtyard, the frescoes patient in their dark. And Dante, who had come to the Sala Grande that first evening and said nothing in particular, but had stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she'd been carrying with her through the entire week in the city. January was cold. The restoration work entered a new phase. She was working on the south wall now, the section adjacent to the hidden panel, methodically building toward the spring reveal she'd promised. The work was good, deeply absorbing, the quality of her days in the Sala Grande having taken on a texture she associated with the best periods of her professional life. That sense of complete presence, of being exactly where your particular skills and your particular attention were most needed. She was in her studio at 9 in the evening, working on the painting that had been developing since November, the door and room painting that had grown from a single canvas to a triptych as she'd added panels, when she heard the car in the courtyard. Not one car, 3. She put down her brush and went to the window. The courtyard below was lit by the security lights, motion activated, bright. 3 black cars, men getting out, 6, 7, she counted. And from the leading car, Dante, who was standing in the courtyard with the stillness of a man who had seen this coming and had prepared for it, speaking to 2 men she didn't recognize. A 4th car arrived. Something cold moved through her. Not fear, exactly. The alertness she'd felt in the rain garden multiplied. She stayed at the window for a moment, then went downstairs. Signora Fabri was in the entrance hall, which was unusual. The signora was not typically in the entrance hall at 9 at night. She looked at Ilara with an expression she'd never seen on the older woman's face before, something tightly controlled that was still, beneath the control, concern. "Miss Voss," she said, "what's happening?" "Please return to your room." "Signora, the dottore has given instructions. You are to remain upstairs. Ricci is on the 2nd floor." She paused. "This will resolve tonight." Ilara looked at her. At the certainty in the words, "this will resolve," which was either a comfort or a threat, depending on who was saying it and why. She went back upstairs, not to her room, to the door at the end of the 2nd floor corridor that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the back garden, which also overlooked, from an angle, the side of the courtyard. She watched. The meeting, if it was a meeting, was brief, 10-15 minutes. The controlled quality of Dante's body language from a distance, the economy of his gestures, the particular way he stood when something required him to absorb rather than react. 2 of the men she didn't recognize appeared to be doing most of the talking. One of the men she recognized from a previous visit, from the meetings she'd overheard in the study, appeared to be mediating. Then something changed. A voice rose, not Dante's, one of the strangers, and Dante's response, which she couldn't hear but could read in the set of his shoulders, in the precise stillness that followed, had the quality of something conclusive. 2 of the 7 men took a step back. The other 5 stood very still. And then it was over. The way a piece of music reaches its resolution, not with a crash, but with a particular held note that declares, "This is where we land." The strangers left. The courtyard cleared. Dante turned and looked up, not at the balcony where she was standing, but at the house itself, with the expression of a man completing an accounting. Then he went inside. She came back through the corridor and was nearly to the main staircase when she heard him on it, coming up. They met on the landing. He stopped when he saw her. He was not dishevelled, not visibly altered, but there was something, a quality of the aftermath of something intense that had been held and released that she recognized from his face. "You were upstairs," he said. "On the balcony," she admitted. He looked at her for a moment. Not angry. Something more complicated. The assessment of someone deciding how much of themselves to show. "It's resolved," he said. "The Rome situation. The faction." A pause. They agreed to terms. Are you all right? He looked at her directly, the way he sometimes did when she asked him something that caught him off guard in its simplicity.
Yes. Good. She held his gaze. I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. A brief stillness. Then he nodded. I know what you are, she said. I've known since October. I'm not going to pretend I don't, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter, because it does. It changes the calculus of, she paused, of everything. But it doesn't change what I feel. And I think you know that. And I think you've been, she chose carefully, protecting me from the full weight of what this is, because you think if I understand it completely, I'll leave. And I want to tell you that I'm capable of making that assessment myself. I'm not naive, and I'm not 17 years old, and I'm not leaving. The silence on the landing was very specific. He looked at her for a long time, the grey eyes moving over her face with the quality of someone reading something that requires full attention. Then he said, You should probably know all of it. I'd like that. Not tonight. No, not tonight. He reached out, slowly, with the deliberateness that characterized all his significant movements, and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, his hand around hers, warm and certain. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. They stood on the landing of the old staircase in the house that held 6 centuries of secrets in its walls, and held hands in the dark. He told her everything on a Thursday afternoon. They sat in the library, the room that had become their room, the room where he'd accepted the proposal and where they'd had the first real conversation, and he talked for 3 hours. He was precise, methodical, almost academic in his approach, beginning at the beginning, the family's origins in the 15th century, the nature of the operation as it had evolved through the centuries, the contemporary structure and its position in the landscape of Italian organized crime, which was not, he was careful to distinguish, the same as the Sicilian Cosa Nostra or the Neapolitan Camorra, but a different and older animal, more embedded in the institutional life of the city, more entangled with the legitimate structures. He told her about the operations, the financial, the property, the relationships with political figures that were, in his telling, less corrupt than symbiotic, the family managing things that the official structures either couldn't or preferred not to manage, in exchange for the space to operate. He told her about the deaths that had occurred under his watch, not many, and in the controlled clinical way of a man who had carried each one and was not attempting to minimize them. He told her about the threat from Rome, now resolved, and what had been required to resolve it. He told her about his father, who had run the operation before him, and who had died when Dante was 27, in circumstances that were technically an accident, and practically the result of a decision that had been made by someone else. He told her about the years after that, the consolidation, the particular difficulty of inheriting leadership of an organization at 27, when half of it thought you were too young, and the other half thought you were too much your father's son. He told her all of it, and said nothing that asked for absolution or sympathy. He stated facts and let them be what they were. When he finished, the fire had burned low, and the afternoon light through the library windows had gone to the flat blue of winter dusk. Ilara sat with everything she'd been given and thought about it. Really thought. Not the processing she sometimes did automatically, but the deep, considered thinking she gave to condition assessments, to the question of what a damaged painting was asking her to do. The half-brother in Rome, she said. He was part of the faction. Dante looked at her. Yes.
And he agreed to terms. He's still living, yes. That was a choice you made, to offer terms instead of the other option. Yes. Why? He looked at the low fire. Because he's my brother, and because his usefulness to the family isn't exhausted, and because I am not my father. He paused. And because he is young, and some of what he wanted was not wrong, only his method of pursuing it. She looked at him. That's complicated. Life in structures like this is complicated. The difference between what I am and what is depicted in more theatrical versions of this world is that the theatrical version is about power. What I actually do, he paused, is about maintenance, about keeping something very old and very fragile from destroying itself, about managing the obligations that accumulate over 600 years of arrangements. He met her eyes. I am not a saint. I have done things that I carry, but I am not mindlessly brutal. I am not what the opera makes of this. She nodded slowly. I know. You always knew. I read the walls, she said. He almost smiled, the closest he came, the slight softening at the corner of his mouth. Yes, you do. She got up from her chair and crossed to his, and sat on the arm of it the way she'd sat on it in the Sala Grande in December, and he put his arm around her the same way, with the same certainty. I'm still not leaving, she said. He pulled her against him, properly, not the restrained gesture of before, but the full warmth of someone who had been holding back and had decided not to any more, and pressed his lips to her hair. I know, he said. God help me, I know. They stayed like that, while the fire went grey, and the library settled into the particular dark of winter evenings in old houses. And outside, the rain began again, against the windows of Villa Morciano. Winter became spring with the slow inevitability of all Tuscan seasons. The work on the frescoes had crossed, somewhere in February, from restoration into something that felt to Alara like conversation. She was no longer merely repairing damage, but entering into dialogue with the original, making decisions about what the painter had intended that required her to inhabit the painter's mind as nearly as possible, to think with 500-year-old hands and eyes. Her own painting had changed radically. She had acknowledged this to herself in February and then to Dante in March. Standing in her studio while he looked at the triptych, now 6 panels, a sequence that sprawled across 2 walls, and saying, I don't know if it's better or just more. It's more, he'd said. Which is better? That's not necessarily true. For you it is. He'd turned to look at her with the directness that she'd learned was his form of intimacy. You were limiting yourself, in the earlier work, containing it to what you were certain of. And now I'm not certain. And now it shows. He'd paused. The uncertainty is the thing you were missing. She'd looked at the panels, the expanding sequence, the door and the room behind the door, which had become a series of rooms, each one containing something she couldn't have articulated in words, but which felt necessary to record. I'm painting us, she'd said. Not a confession, a recognition. He'd stood very still for a moment. I know. Is that all right? He'd turned to look at her with an expression she'd been cataloguing all winter, the one that was too many things at once for his face's architecture to contain. You paint what you see, he'd said. I would not ask you to stop seeing. Their relationship, if she was going to use the word, had the quality of the restoration work itself, slow, layered, built up through accumulation of small, deliberate gestures rather than grand declarations. He kissed her in the library. He brought her coffee in the mornings, sometimes, leaving it outside the studio door when she was working without knocking, a consideration that she found, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, more affecting than any grand gesture. He told her things, gradually, incrementally, about the operation, about the challenges, about decisions he was making, with the deliberateness of someone sharing access to a room they'd previously kept locked. She told him things in return, about Baltimore, about why she'd come to Florence, the restlessness, the sense at 25 that the American life she'd been moving toward was somehow wrong for the particular way her brain and hands worked. About her parents, who were divorced and cordial about it, who had been baffled in equally cordial ways by their daughter who wanted to spend her life looking at old walls. About the early years, the poverty of them, the particular cold of renting a room in a city where you knew no one and had no safety net. "That's why you didn't run when you found out about me," he said one evening, in the kind of post-analysis mood that came over him occasionally, a careful retrospective that she'd come to appreciate. "You've spent years making decisions about where to put your trust, based on your own assessment rather than conventional risk categories." She thought about it. Maybe, or maybe I just have bad judgment. You have excellent judgment. About work, about people. A pause. About me. About you. You saw what I was before I showed you. You didn't run then, either. "I had rent to pay," she said. He looked at her with the almost smile. "Of course." She reached over and covered his hand with hers on the library table, a gesture that was still, even 3 months in, slightly charged with the awareness that she was touching him, that this was allowed, that he would receive it. His hand turned under hers and held it. Just that. Just the quiet certainty of it. She was, she recognized, deeply, inconveniently, and entirely in love with him. She was not going to say it yet. She was a woman who believed in the exact right moment for exact right words. But it was there, a fact as solid as the restoration work, as irrevocable as the fresco's layers. The villa had changed too, in small ways, or rather, she had changed in relation to it. It had become, with the gradual accumulation of months and conversations and cold mornings and late evenings, not a place she was working, but a place she lived. She knew which floorboard on the second landing creaked. She knew the way the morning light moved through the Sala Grande across the seasons, the particular quality of it in February, very different from October. She knew Signora Fabri's moods, the older woman who had maintained her professional composure with impressive consistency, had developed a relationship with Alara that expressed itself in small domestic attentions, the best cuts of meat appearing on her dinner plate, the occasionally unnecessary but clearly deliberate arrangement of flowers in her room. And Richie, who had moved from watchful assessment to something that she thought might actually be a kind of protectiveness, not of her from the world, but of her from interruptions when she was working in the Sala Grande. She'd found him on 2 occasions gently redirecting visitors who had been about to come upstairs unannounced. She was part of the household. The fact of it was simple and enormous. One evening in March, Dante came to find her in the studio. He knocked now, always knocked, a courtesy she found endearing in its deliberateness, and said there was someone he wanted her to meet. The someone was a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed, with the silver hair and courtly manner of a certain generation of Florentine nobility. He was introduced as Professore Cataneo, and was, Dante explained in a brief aside, the family's historical advisor, a legitimate academic with a specialty in Renaissance Florence who had worked with the Morziano for 30 years. "He's reviewed your condition reports," Dante said. "He has some observations about the iconographic program." Ilara looked at the Professore and understood immediately that what Dante was doing, what he'd arranged, with the careful deliberateness he brought to all significant gestures, was giving her a colleague, a peer in the intellectual dimension of the work, someone with whom she could discuss the historical and iconographic dimensions of what she was doing in a register that went beyond what their evening conversations could provide. She looked at Dante. He met her eyes briefly, the direct look, steady, and turned to introduce her formally to the Professore. She spent 2 hours with Cataneo and came away with a notebook full of new references and a revised understanding of 3 iconographic elements in the south wall that she'd been uncertain about for weeks. That evening, she found Dante in the library before dinner and said simply, "Thank you. That was exactly what I needed." He looked up from his book. "I thought it might be." "How long have you been thinking about it?" "Since January." He said it with the matter-of-fact quality that she'd come to understand meant it was true. "You'd been working around certain questions in the iconography for weeks. You needed someone with his specific background." She sat across from him. "You pay very close attention." "Yes," he said simply. "Does that ever—" She paused. "Does it ever feel like too much? The attention. I know it can be exhausting." He looked at her. "It doesn't feel like too much," he said. "It feels like what I do." A pause. "With you it feels—" he searched for the word. "Natural. It's the only thing I do that doesn't require effort." She held that, the weight of it. "I love you," she said. Not planned, not the exact right moment she'd been waiting for, just true and available and refusing to be held. He was very still. Then he set down his book. He got up from his chair and crossed to her and took her face in both hands the way he had in December and kissed her. Not the brief, deliberate kiss of December, but something longer, more thorough, with the same quality of certainty, but containing, now, the months of accumulation, the library and the frescoes and the rain garden and the cold coffee and the held hands, and all of it. When he pulled back, his hands were still at her face. "Ilara," he said, her name with its full, careful weight. "You don't have to," she began. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since October, when you looked at the frescoes and began immediately to understand what was actually being said." He paused. "I was not expecting to. I was not looking for it. But here it is. Here it is," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers, his hands warm at her face. "Here it is," he said again. Spring came to the villa in the way of Tuscan springs. Suddenly, overwhelmingly, the hills going from grey-green to a green that was almost violent in its abundance, the garden exploding into something that Ilara understood, in her first spring in the house, was actually tended, that Signora Fabri's domain extended to the grounds as well as the interior, and that someone understood exactly which roses were supposed to grow where. She opened the sealed panel in the first week of April. She had prepared for it methodically over the preceding 2 weeks, documenting the panel's exterior in detail, testing the adhesive around the canvas frame to understand its composition and the most effective method of removal, arranging the scaffolding and lighting with the care that a significant discovery, and she was almost certain now that it was significant, required. She asked Dante if he wanted to be present. Yes, he said. It could be, she paused, distressing, depending on what's there. I know what's there, he said. You told me what you thought. The execution, Marta de Luca's witness. Knowing conceptually and seeing are different. He looked at her steadily. I know that too. I'd still like to be present. On the first Tuesday in April, at 10 in the morning, the best light, the spring sun coming through the windows and filling the Sala Grande with a warmth it hadn't had all winter, they removed the canvas. The adhesive came away cleanly with the solvent she'd developed for this purpose, and Ilara worked methodically around the frame, Marco assisting, the process careful and slow. The canvas was lifted in sections. It was large, perhaps 1.5 meters by 2, and set against the sheeted furniture. The fresco behind it was, as she had known it would be, extraordinary. It was painted in the same hand as the rest of the Sala Grande, Marta di Luca, unmistakably, but in a register unlike any of the other panels. Not formal, not ceremonial. Intimate and terrible. The scene it depicted was the courtyard below. She recognized the fountain, the cypress trees, the arrangement of the stone, and in it a man was kneeling in the centre of the gravel while, behind him, another figure stood with a sword. Around the periphery, at precise intervals, witnesses. Family members, from their dress, the formal Morsiano 16th century attire she'd been looking at for 6 months. And in the foreground, one figure who stood apart from the arranged witnesses. Not formal, not placed at the required distance, closer than she should have been, close enough that the sword's proximity had a different quality in relation to her, close enough that her face was fully legible, not the stylized formality of the other figures. Her face. The painter had painted herself into the foreground. Her own face, younger than the artist's self-portraits Ilara had identified in the background of other panels, less guarded, open with a grief that was not hidden or stylized or contained. She was looking at the kneeling man, and the kneeling man, Ilara had to look closely to use the loupe to stand on the scaffold and bring the UV light to bear, was looking back at her. Not at the sword, not at the family behind him, at her. She stood on the scaffold and looked at this for a long time, at the 500-year-old record of 2 people who loved each other, painted by one of them on the day the other died, in a room that had then been sealed from view for 2.5 centuries. Dante was standing below the scaffold, looking up at the panel. He had not spoken since the canvas was removed. His face had the quality she'd seen in the rain garden, the unguarded quality, the architecture not entirely in place. She came down. She stood beside him. After a moment, she took his hand. He gripped it, not controlled, not deliberate, but with the reflexive necessity of someone who needs an anchor. She loved him. he said. Yes, and she painted it anyway, knowing it would be sealed. She painted it because she loved him, because it was the only thing left to give him. She paused, because to witness something truly is the highest form of caring for it. He was looking at the panel, at the man's face turned toward the woman's, at what was between them in the space of those painted inches, in the last moment before the sword, holding nothing back. Aurelio Morsiano, he said, the patriarch who had ordered the execution, was, by all accounts, a man who believed in honesty, who documented what he did. He paused. I think he knew she loved him. I think he let her paint it because he thought she deserved the record of it, of what she felt. That's possible, she said, or he sealed it because he regretted it, because he couldn't look at it. Both things can be true. Both things can be true, she agreed. They stood with the 500-year-old grief and its beauty in the spring light, while Marco quietly and efficiently backed out of the room and gave them the space they needed. The nightclub was called Nero, and it occupied the basement of a converted palazzo in the Santo Spirito neighbourhood of Florence, and Ilara found herself there on a Saturday night in May because Dante had a meeting that had required his attendance at an event he considered neither enjoyable nor avoidable, and he had asked her to come. It's a public event, he'd said, fundraiser, the kind where certain people gather under the cover of social occasion to conduct business at the edges. You want me there? I would like you there. The distinction, she'd learned, was significant. It is not required, it is not expected by anyone whose expectations matter, but— He'd paused. I am past the point of managing my preferences about this. Which was, she understood, the most expansive declaration of want she was likely to get from him in a context that wasn't the library, with his hands at her face. She wore a dress she'd bought in March, wine-red silk, column-cut, with the particular combination of simplicity and expense that she'd learned from Florence and from the months in the villa was the only aesthetic language worth speaking when the alternative was trying too hard. Her hair was up, loosely, in the way that looked deliberately undone and took 20 minutes to achieve. She borrowed 2 inches of Signora Fabri's most impassive approval. Dante looked at her when she came downstairs and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Good," which was, from him, a great deal. The nightclub was dark and loud and expensive in the theatrical way of Italian elite spaces, the darkness velvet rather than obscure, the sound controlled and immersive, the crowd composed of people who moved with the confidence of money. Dante moved through it with the ease of someone in his natural habitat, which it both was and wasn't, she understood. He was comfortable here because he was comfortable in most environments, the adaptability of someone who had learned to operate across different registers. He kept her close. Not possessively in the obvious way, not with a hand at her back and a territorial glare, but with the subtle management of proximity she'd come to understand was how he expressed it. The slight angle of his body toward her in every conversation, the way he positioned himself in any room so that she was within his immediate reach. There were conversations. She met people, some of whom she filed away in the mental cabinet of the Morsiano landscape she'd been building all year. Some who were simply wealthy Florentines with no particular relationship to anything except their own comfort. She held her own, which she'd expected to be able to do. She had a good education, interesting work, and the particular conversational confidence of someone who had spent years dealing with clients who expected to be deferred to. At some point in the middle of the evening, a man named Lorenzo Ferretti appeared at her shoulder while Dante was in conversation across the room. Ferretti was perhaps 40, attractive in the practiced way of men who invest significant effort in their appearance, with the kind of easy charm that was either natural or very well rehearsed. He brought her a drink, replacing the one she'd just finished, a detail she registered, and said with a smile she distrusted immediately, "You're the restoration artist at the Morciano Villa." "I am," she said. "Fascinating work. I've always admired the Sala Grande." He paused. "I was a frequent visitor to the villa, some years ago, before—" Another pause, waited. "Different times." She looked at him. "You knew the family?" "I know Dante well." The pause again, that particular quality of information being delivered and enjoying its own delivery. "I imagine the work there provides interesting perspectives on the family history." She took a sip of the drink, good champagne. She noted this, the investment of it, and said pleasantly, "The frescoes are extraordinary. 16th century primarily. The technical quality of the painter is exceptional." He smiled. The smile had the quality of someone who expected to get further than he was getting. "And the family's current history? As interesting as the historical?" "All history is interesting if you know how to read it," she said. "What brings you here tonight, Signore Ferretti?" He looked at her for a moment, and something in his assessment of her, the recalibration she could see happening, shifted. "Business," he said, the charm slightly adjusted. "The usual." "Of course," she smiled. "Excuse me." She moved away, not toward Dante, she wouldn't play that card, but toward a cluster of people she'd been introduced to earlier. She didn't look back at Ferretti. She kept her pace even, her expression social, and filed the entire exchange in the cabinet marked "Report to Dante" in the car going home. 20 minutes later, Dante appeared at her side, not arriving, simply present, the way he was in rooms. He had a hand at the small of her back, light but definite. "Ferretti," he said quietly. He introduced himself. "I didn't encourage it." "I know." A pause. What did he want? Information about the villa, dressed as conversation about the restoration work. She glanced up at him. He implied he was a former associate. He was. He's also currently affiliated with the Rome faction. The Rome faction that had been resolved in January. She remembered the courtyard, the still figures, the held note. "He'll try again. Don't be alone with him." "I wasn't planning to be." He looked at her, the direct look. "You handled it well." "I read people well," she said. "Professionally trained skill." The almost smile. "Of course." They stayed another hour, long enough for Dante's purposes, whatever they were, and then the car came and they went back through the night city, through the May dark, through the streets that smelled of flowers and restaurant air and the particular warmth of Florence in early summer. In the car he took her hand and held it without speaking. She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the city go by. "You were watching me the whole time," she said, "even when you were across the room." "Yes." "Is that always going to be how it is?" He was quiet for a moment. "Probably." "All right," she said. "All right." She turned her head to look at him, the profile against the passing lights. "I'd rather be watched by you than ignored by anyone else."
He turned to look at her then, the grey eyes in the moving light. "Ilara," he said. "Don't say anything," she said. "It's fine." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture that was old-fashioned and entirely unself-conscious, and then held it again. They drove the rest of the way home in the good silence. She found it in the hidden panel. Not the panel itself, that was open now, the fresco beautifully revealed, its surface carefully stabilized under her hands over 3 weeks of work in April. She'd mapped every inch of it, documented it in UV and infrared and the full photographic battery, written a condition report that ran to 60 pages and which Professore Cataneo had read with barely contained scholarly excitement. What she found was behind the hidden panel, not physically behind the fresco, but in the layers. Under UV examination of the lowest section of the hidden panel, the section where the gravel of the courtyard was depicted, where the figure's feet rested, she had identified what appeared to be an earlier layer of paint. A different composition, predating the execution scene, predating even Marta di Luca's arrival in the house. She had been trained to be careful about what she thought she was seeing in underpaintings. The history of fresco restoration was littered with interpretive errors, with projections and wishful readings that turned out, under closer examination, to be nothing. She had spent 2 days telling herself it was nothing. On the 3rd day, she brought in Cataneo. He spent 4 hours with the UV equipment and the infrared reflectography, and at the end of it, he sat on the edge of the scaffold with the look of a man who has just encountered something that required complete reordering of his professional assumptions. "This is older," he said. "This layer. Much older." "How much older?" "Based on the pigment composition," he stopped. "I would want to test it, properly." "But the handling, the medium," he shook his head slightly. "Possibly 14th century. She stood with that. 14th century. A full 150 years before Marta di Luca, before the Florentine period of the fresco cycle, before... She thought through what the chronicle contained, what Cataneo had told her about the family's documented history, before the earliest records in the chronicle she'd been using. "Can you read it?" she said. "The underpainting?" "Parts of it." He was quiet for a moment. "There's an inscription, more clearly preserved than the painting, actually. The plaster layer above it was applied with unusual care, as if whoever placed it wanted to preserve rather than obliterate." She waited. "The inscription is in Latin," he said. "And it is..." He paused. "It is a name, a family name, not Morciano." He looked at her. "An earlier name, an older one." She felt something cold and certain move through her. "The family didn't originate in Florence." "No," he said, "or rather, they did not always call themselves Morciano. This inscription suggests an earlier family, in the same location, with a different name, who were perhaps absorbed or became..." He stopped. "The Morciano are their descendants," she said. "I cannot say that with certainty from this alone." "But you think so?" He looked at the inscription. "I think," he said carefully, "that this house has been in the possession of the same family, under successive names, for considerably longer than the chronicle indicates." A pause, which would make it one of the oldest continuously occupied private properties in Tuscany. She went to find Dante. He was in the study at his desk when she knocked and entered. He looked up and saw her face and set down whatever he'd been reading. "What is it?" She told him. She was careful, precise. She was a scientist. She gave him the evidence and the hypothesis and the confidence interval separately. She watched his face through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "There are things in the family history," he said finally, "that are not in the chronicle." He paused. "Things that predate it, that were never written in any document I've seen." He stood and moved to the window. "My grandfather, my father's father, told me once that the family had been in this house longer than the name, that the name was a convenience, an adaptation. He didn't say more than that." He turned to look at her. "I always assumed it was an old man's mythology, the stories families tell about their own age." "It may not be mythology." "No." He was very still. "What do you need to know more?" "I want to take a sample from the underpainting layer for dating. Carefully, it won't damage the surface visibly. I know exactly where to take it from. And I want access to whatever the family holds that predates the chronicle. The chronicle is the earliest document I know of. There might be others, things that were held separately, the kind of records a family keeps that they don't keep in the main document." He looked at her steadily. "I'll look." He paused. "Ilara, what does this change? For the restoration?" "It doesn't change the restoration," she said. "It changes what the restoration is of. If this house has been in continuous family possession for 6 centuries or more, if the frescoes are the record of an even longer history than we thought, then what I'm doing is not just restoring a 16th century commission." She paused. "I'm preserving the record of one of the oldest continuous family histories in Italy." He looked at her for a long moment, the grey eyes holding something she recognized, the quality of a man encountering, after years of managing things, something that exceeded his management. "My grandfather would have—" He stopped, paused. "He would have liked you," he said. She crossed the room to him. He took her face in his hands, not the kiss, not yet, just holding her, and looked at her with the full attention that was his form of saying what he couldn't say. "Keep going," he said, "as long as you need." "I intend to," she said. That evening, after dinner, she went to her studio and began a new canvas. Not the sequence that had been growing since November. Something new, larger. She stretched a canvas that was 1.5 meters by 2 meters, the same dimensions as the sealed panel, and stood before it with a brush in her hand and thought about what was painted over what was painted over what was painted, and the names families used, and the way the oldest truths were the ones that required the most layers above them to preserve. She began to paint. It was midnight before she stopped. When she did, she stepped back and looked at what she'd made and didn't name it, because it didn't need a name. It already knew what it was. The summer moved through the villa with the heat and the golden quality of Tuscan Julys, the light intensifying each morning until the Sala Grande became almost impossible to work in at midday, the direct sun bleaching the colours, flattening the surface. And she shifted her working hours to the early mornings and the late afternoons, the golden windows of the day when the light came at the right angle and the frescoes were most themselves. Her own work had entered a period she had only experienced twice before in her life. Once at 22, in her first year of serious painting, when everything she attempted seemed to come through her hands with a directness that bypassed her technical knowledge entirely. And once at 26, in the year before she came to Florence, when she'd made 6 paintings in 3 months that still seemed to her the best things she'd ever done.
This was that, but larger. The large canvas from the night of the discovery had led to 3 more, a series, she understood now, though she hadn't planned it. Large scale, layered, built over weeks with the same methodology she used in the restoration work, the surfaces dense with accumulation and meaning. Cataneo had brought a colleague, a dating specialist from the University of Siena, to examine the underpainting sample, and the results had come back in June. The pigment composition was consistent with 14th century Florentine painting. The plaster layer above it was consistent with the 16th century. There had, definitively, been a fresco in the Sala Grande before Marta de Luca's commission, and it had been preserved with unusual care before the later work was applied over it. The family name in the inscription was Alini. Dante had, after 2 weeks of looking, found a document. Not in the villa, in a bank vault in Florence, in a safety deposit box that had apparently been maintained continuously by successive heads of the family since 1892, which was the date of the earliest box contract he'd found. The document was old, older than the chronicle by its appearance, the vellum condition and ink oxidation suggesting 15th century at the latest. And it was written in a hand that predated the chronicle's author. It named the Alini family as the original builders of the structure on the site of the villa, a date it gave as 1342, and described a consolidation of the Alini and Morciano families through marriage in 1478. At which point, the document noted, the combined family had taken the Morciano name for reasons of civic clarity. The name that was known and feared in the business of the city was the better one to carry. She sat with Dante in the library and they read it together, and she felt the particular joy of the researcher who has found what they were looking for and discovered it was more than they expected. 680 years, she said. Approximately. He was looking at the document with an expression she'd learned to read as the specific gravity he brought to things that cost him something, that moved in him beneath the control, that required the architecture. "What does it mean for you?" she said. "Not for the restoration. For you." He was quiet for a moment. "My father never knew this," he said. "He had the box. He knew the box. But he died before he—" A pause. "Before he looked." She held the weight of that with him. Or perhaps he did look, he said, and didn't know what to do with it. He set the document on the table. He was not a man given to the past. He managed the present with great ferocity and considered the past a luxury. "And you?" He turned to look at her. "I think the past is the only reliable evidence for what is true." She looked at him. "That's why you wanted the restoration done properly. That's why it mattered to you, not just the aesthetic, not just the historical record, but the evidence," he said, "of what we are, of what this has always been." He met her eyes. "You gave me that. What you found. It's—" He stopped. "It's more than I expected." She looked at him. The grey eyes and the strong face and the architecture he maintained and the person that moved beneath it, who was, she had come to understand, capable of a depth of feeling that his manner only partly concealed. "I'm not finished," she said. "The restoration. There's another year at least. The final sections, the conservation treatment, the documentation." "I know. And the underpainting. If there's more to find beneath the other sections, which I think there might be, that's another year after that." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to finish." I know you're not. She paused. I'm saying I'm staying. Not because of the work, because of... She gestured at the library, the house, him, this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, not the controlled, deliberate gesture, but the simple, certain reach of someone who was past managing it. The underpainting, he said. You'll look beneath the other sections. Yes. And what you find there, it's yours, as much as the family's, the discovery. Technically it belongs to the house, Ilara. His grip on her hand was steady. What I mean is... He paused, and something in his face was different. The architecture adjusted in a way she'd only seen a few times. I mean that what you have built here, in the house, in the work, in... He stopped. I mean that I want you to stay. Not just for the restoration, not for any fixed term. I mean... I know what you mean, she said quietly. Do you? She looked at him. Yes. And? She tightened her hand in his. Yes, she said again. That too. The summer light came through the library windows and lay warm and golden on the floor, on the books, on the old wood of the table between them. Outside, the cypresses were perfectly still in the midday heat. Somewhere in the house, Signora Fabri moved through her daily maintenance with the impassive certainty of someone who had never doubted this outcome. Ilara looked at the man across the table from her, the man who had stood in a rain garden at 3 a.m. and told her that physical reality was the counterpressure to architecture, who had told her that the best art was made from what we can't say any other way, who had kissed her in December with the certainty of someone declaring something, who had told her everything and asked nothing except that she see it clearly and make her own choice. I have something to tell you, she said. He looked at her, the full attention, the grey eyes. The large canvas, the one I started in May, she paused. It's finished. I know. You finished it last week. She looked at him. You've seen it. I've seen it every day since you started it. He said it simply. I go up while you're working in the Sala Grande. I hope you don't object. She thought about this, about him going up to her studio in the mornings while she was below with the frescoes, standing in the north light with the large canvas. No, she said, I don't object. It's... He stopped. The architecture adjusted again. It's the most true thing I've ever seen. She looked at him. What do you see in it? He was quiet for a long moment. A house, he said, and someone who learned its language. And what that language... He stopped. What it becomes when it's spoken back. She looked at the fire that had burned low. They lit it in the library even in summer, the old stone rooms needing it in the evenings, and thought about Marta di Luca, who had come from Siena and painted for 3 years and witnessed a death and disappeared from the records, who had painted herself in the foreground with her grief exposed, 5 feet from the man she loved and 5 centuries from anyone who would understand why. She thought about the underpainting beneath the underpainting, the Alini name in the oldest layer, the families that accumulated, one over the other, each one preserving what was below by covering it, the protection indistinguishable from concealment, until someone arrived with the right light. She thought about the particular mercy of being seen. Come upstairs, she said. I want to show you the new canvas properly, in the real light. He stood. Now? Now. He took her hand and they went upstairs, through the old house, through the marble entrance hall and the wrought iron staircase with its carved vines and birds, up to the third-floor studio where the north light was golden and horizontal in the late afternoon, and the large canvas stood on its easel with everything she'd learned to risk. He stood before it for a long time. She stood beside him and didn't speak. Then he put his arm around her, not the restrained gesture, not the controlled, deliberate one, but simply around her, the full warmth of him, and held her. The frescoes in the Sala Grande below them would outlast them both. Marta de Luca's grief and her love and her witness, the execution scene and the two faces turned toward each other in the last moment, had already outlasted everyone who knew the names involved, would go on outlasting people for centuries. The inscription in the oldest layer, the Alini name in 14th century pigment, had survived 600 years of plaster and fresco and the ordinary acts of living that generated so much more rubble than anything deliberate. Ilara leaned into Dante's warmth and looked at her own painting in the evening light and knew, with the certainty she'd learned to trust, the painter's certainty that recognized truth in the image before she could name it in words, that this was the room behind the door. The one she'd been painting since November. The sequence of approaches, the series of canvases that circled and hesitated and came finally to rest here. The room she'd decided to enter. Outside, the Tuscan hills held their ancient indifference to the particular human urgency of love, the way they always had. The same hills Marta de Luca had looked at from these windows. The same hills the Alini family had built their first structure into. The same hills over which the Morciano had managed their 6th century arrangement with power and obligation, and the peculiar ethics of people who understand themselves to be the custodians of something that predates them and will outlast them. The hills would be there tomorrow. The frescoes would be there. The inscription in the oldest layer would be there, patient in the plaster, waiting for its correct translation. Ilara tightened her arm around Dante's waist, and he pressed his lips to her temple, and they stood in the warm evening light of the studio, while the house breathed around them with all its centuries of secrets preserved, and its oldest truths simply, finally, brought to light.